At a dying county auction, mechanic Ethan Mercer stood up in front of wealthy collectors, seasoned dealers, and a CEO with $1,000 blazer, and spent every dollar he had on 17 heaps of rust nobody wanted. The crowd didn't just doubt him, they laughed. Cassandra Hale, one of the most powerful names in American automotive, leaned to her assistant and said it loud enough for the front row to hear. That man just set fire to his future. By morning, the video had 2 million views. By noon, Ethan was the internet's favorite fool. They had no idea what was buried underneath that rust. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And if it hits you the way it hit me, hit like before we get to the end. The auction was held at the Harlan County Fairgrounds on a Tuesday in October, which was already a sign that nobody serious expected much from it. The fairgrounds sat 12 miles outside of Millhaven, Tennessee, on a flat stretch of land that smelled like diesel and cut grass, and the particular kind of disappointment that accumulates in places people only visit when they have to. The main pavilion, a corrugated steel building the size of a minor league gymnasium, had been repurposed for the day with folding chairs, a plywood podium, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look a little sick. Outside, across 3 acres of gravel lot divided by orange rope into numbered sections, sat the inventory, farm equipment, estate furniture, 2 broken riding mowers, a box lot of power tools, and in the far northeast corner, Section G, what the auction catalog described simply as assorted automotive, non-running, as is, no warranty, no title guarantee. 17 vehicles. Most people who walked through Section G that morning kept walking. A few stopped long enough to kick a tire or peek through a window caked with grime, then shook their heads and moved on. The vehicles had been sitting somewhere, multiple somewheres actually, pulled from 4 different estates across 2 counties, for so long that in several cases the metal had fused with the ground beneath it. Weeds had grown through floorboards. One car had a small tree, maybe 4 feet tall, pushing up through the hood from below, roots threading through the engine block like something that had decided to make a home there. The Harlan County auction wasn't the kind of event that attracted serious money. It was the kind of event that attracted opportunists, curiosity seekers, small-time resellers, who combed estate lots for items they could flip on the internet, and, on this particular Tuesday, one notable exception. Cassandra Hale arrived at 9:15 in a black Escalade with tinted windows and a driver who didn't speak. She stepped out in a charcoal blazer, dark slacks, boots that had never seen unpaved ground before that morning, and the kind of composed, slightly impatient expression worn by people accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around their arrival. She was 44 years old. She had been the chief executive officer of Heartline Automotive Group for 6 years, following 12 years of climbing through its legal and strategy divisions. And she had not come to Harlan County for the folding chairs. She had come because her legal team had told her there was a possibility, slim but real, that one of the vehicles in Section G was something Heartline had been looking for quietly for nearly a decade. Her team had done preliminary research. The provenance was murky. The paper trail was incomplete. There was a 30% chance, they said, of it being what they thought it was. Maybe less. Cassandra put the odds closer to 15, but she'd flown to worse places for worse odds, so here she was. Her assistant, a 26-year-old named Prentice, who carried an iPad with a cracked screen and could recite patent numbers from memory, fell into step beside her as she crossed the gravel lot toward the pavilion. Section G is northeast corner, Prentice said. 17 units. We've identified 4 possibles based on the partial VINs the auction house provided. 2 are almost certainly not it. 1 is a strong maybe, one we can't rule out. Which one are we watching? Lot 34. What's left of a 1971 fastback? The catalog lists it as unidentified domestic, heavy surface rust, incomplete. Seller's estate didn't have documentation. That's not much to go on. No, but the dimensions are right, and the body line in the photo. Prentice tilted the iPad toward her. See the roof line there? That curve. It's not production standard. Cassandra looked at it for 2 seconds. It could be anything. It could be, Prentice agreed. But our IP counsel says if it is what we think it is, even in this condition, it would be material evidence. Given the filing deadline, I know the deadline. She handed the iPad back. What's the reserve? No reserve on Section G. Open bidding. Whole section goes as a lot. She stopped walking. The whole section? All 17? Auction house bundled them. Apparently none of the individual units had enough interest to justify separate listings. They're hoping to move the whole lot to a single buyer. Cassandra looked across the gravel toward Section G and its collection of deteriorating metal. She did a quick mental calculation. 17 vehicles, most of them garbage, probably $4,000 in scrap value across the whole lot. Anyone who bought it was taking on disposal costs. The real play, if Lot 34 was what Heartline suspected, was to acquire the section quietly, transport everything to a controlled facility, and have their forensic engineers do a proper examination before anyone else started asking questions. What's our budget? Legal authorized up to $40,000 if necessary. Preferred ceiling of $25,000. We won't need 40, Cassandra said. Nobody else is going to want these things. She was right about that, mostly. Ethan Mercer had driven up from Copeland County in a truck that was 14 years old and had 230,000 miles on it, which he'd put there himself because he drove it like a working vehicle rather than a possession. He left the house at 5:30 a.m., which gave him time to walk Section G twice in the early morning light before the auction opened to the public. He was 41 years old, 5'11", not especially remarkable to look at. He had the kind of hands that told their own story, scarred across the knuckles, permanently stained at the nail beds with grease that no amount of soap entirely removes, thick through the palms from years of gripping tools rather than pens. He wore a canvas work jacket over a gray thermal and jeans that had been washed enough times to go soft. He wasn't wearing anything that cost more than $30, and the total outfit probably came in under $90. He walked Section G slowly. He didn't kick tires. He didn't peer through windows or rock the bodies to test the springs. He moved along the row the way someone moves through a place they're trying to read rather than inspect. Unhurried, quiet, paying attention not just to the vehicles themselves, but to the spaces between details. The way a panel sat. Where the rust was newest versus where it had been longest. What was original and what had been replaced and when. He spent 4 minutes at Lot 34. To the untrained eye, which on that morning was every eye except his, Lot 34 looked like the worst of the 17. It was lower to the ground than it should have been, the suspension having collapsed unevenly so that the left rear sat maybe 6 inches lower than the right. The body was covered in rust so thorough and uniform it had almost achieved a kind of texture, like hammered copper, though the color was closer to dried blood. Both door handles were gone. The windshield was cracked in a pattern that suggested something heavy had been laid against it from the inside at some point. The hood had been sprung. Someone, at some point, had forced it open without the release mechanism, and the front latch was bent outward, the hood sitting slightly proud of the fenders on the leading edge. Ethan crouched beside the rear quarter panel. He spent a moment looking at the body line where the quarter met the trunk, running his thumb along a seam. Then he stood and walked around to the front, leaned over the sprung hood, and looked at what remained of the engine bay. Most of the engine was still there, buried under layers of grime and oxidation, and in the lower reaches, what appeared to be a family of small animals that had lived and died there at some point. But the block itself, the shape of it, was visible beneath the accumulation. He stood up. He put both hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at the car for another moment. Then he walked the rest of Section G at the same unhurried pace, looked at each of the other 16 vehicles with the same attention, and by 8:15 he had seen everything he needed to see. He went and got a coffee from the concession stand, a styrofoam cup, terrible, $2, and sat down in the third row of the pavilion and waited for the auction to begin. Well, the man next to him was named Gary Potts. Ethan knew him distantly from the regional swap meet circuit. Gary ran a small salvage operation out of a yard in Boone County, bought wrecked cars and parted them out for online sales, and had strong opinions about everything and accurate opinions about almost nothing. He was the kind of man who talked during movies. "You here for the farm equipment?" Gary asked, eyeing Ethan's jacket. Section G. Gary made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a dismissal. "The car lot? That whole section is garbage. I walked it this morning. 3 of them are so far gone, the frame's basically part of the ground now. You'd spend more pulling them out than you'd make on the scrap. I know. So what are you... You think there's something worth parting out in there? Because I looked, and I can tell you, whatever's salvageable you could fit in the back of your truck. Not worth what they'll want for the whole lot. Probably not. Gary seemed uncertain how to process this response. He tried a different angle. You see the Escalade out front. Word is that's Cassandra Hale, Heartline Automotive. Ethan had noticed the Escalade. He hadn't needed to hear who it belonged to understand that someone with resources had come to the auction for a specific reason. The way Prentice had photographed Section G on a professional camera while pretending to be casual had been a reasonable tell. I heard, Ethan said. What does Heartline want with a bunch of rust buckets from an estate sale? I don't know, Ethan said, which was a partial truth. He had a strong theory. He wasn't sharing it with Gary Potts. The auctioneer, a compact man in his 50s named Darnell Weeks, who had been running these sales for 20 years and had the voice for it and the patience of a man who understood that money moved slowly, worked through the farm equipment and household lots in the first 2 hours of the morning, interrupted twice by disputes over provenance and once by a buyer's dispute over a set of antique tools that nearly came to pushing before Darnell separated the parties with practiced efficiency. Section G came up at 11:40. Cassandra was in the 4th row with Prentice beside her, both of them doing a credible impression of people who weren't particularly invested. Ethan was still in the 3rd row. There were maybe 60 people in the pavilion at that point, down from the morning peak of 90, and the attention in the room was middling at best. People checking phones, finishing coffees, having sidebar conversations while Darnell ran through the lot description. Section G, 17 vehicles, assorted domestic, all non-running, all as is. We're not guaranteeing titles on any of these. You buy them, you take them, you're responsible for removal inside 30 days. Any questions, address them to the auction office before we open bidding. Darnell paused. We'll open at $500. Who wants to start? Silence. This was normal for Section G. Darnell wasn't bothered. 500 to get us going. Anybody. 500, said a man in the back, who Ethan had clocked earlier as a scrap dealer out of Knoxville. He'd also walked Section G, and his math had told him the scrap value was maybe $3,500. He was establishing a floor. 500, thank you. Looking for 750. Another silence. 750, said Prentice, quietly, without raising her hand, just a small nod that Darnell caught. The scrap dealer from Knoxville looked back at Prentice, registered the iPad and the professional posture, and revised his mental model of the situation. He dropped out. 750, looking for 1,000. 1,500, Ethan said. Cassandra turned. She had not noticed Ethan before that moment, which was not unusual. Ethan occupied rooms in a way that didn't draw attention until he chose to do something with it. She saw a man in a canvas jacket who looked like he worked on things for a living, bidding $1,500 on a section of scrap vehicles at a county fairgrounds auction, and she made a rapid and automatic assessment. Local buyer probably thought he'd found something worth parting out, would run out of money or nerve before things got interesting. 2,000, Prentice said, glancing at Cassandra for confirmation. Cassandra gave a small nod. 2,500, Ethan said. He said it in the same tone he'd been using to answer Gary Potts's questions. There was nothing in his voice that suggested he was at his limit. There was nothing in his voice that suggested very much at all. Cassandra looked at Prentice. Prentice leaned close and said, just loud enough, Our ceiling is 40. We're fine. Cassandra nodded once, crisply. 3,000, she said herself this time, not bothering with the intermediary. The room had gotten quieter. People like Cassandra Hale didn't usually bid directly on county auction lots. The fact that she was bidding personally on a section of rusted vehicles drew a few sideways glances, and at least one person pulled out a phone to film what was happening. Ethan looked at the styrofoam coffee cup in his hand, which was empty. He set it on the floor beside his chair. 2,500, he said. Darnell, to his credit, kept his expression neutral. Sir, the current bid is 3,000. You'd need to come in at 3,100 or above. I know, Ethan said. 2,500. There was a murmur in the room. A couple of people laughed, genuine, confused laughter, the kind you produce when someone does something that doesn't fit any available category. Gary Potts, still seated next to Ethan, said quietly, "Buddy, you can't bid lower than the current." "I understand how an auction works," Ethan said mildly. He reached into his jacket and produced a personal check, already made out for $2,500, and held it up. "I'm offering $2,500 for the whole section. Take it or I walk." This was not how county auctions worked. Darnell knew it, everyone in the room knew it, and Cassandra Hale most certainly knew it. An irregular bid at below the current price, presented as a take-it-or-leave-it offer. It wasn't procedure, and under normal circumstances, Darnell would have thanked the man and moved on. But Darnell Weeks had been running these auctions for 20 years. He knew that the Escalade belonged to someone who would not be coming back to Harlan County if she didn't get what she came for. He knew that the scrap dealer from Knoxville had already folded. He knew that aside from the man in the canvas jacket and the woman in the charcoal blazer, nobody else in the room had any intention of bidding on 17 rusted vehicles, and one of those two people had just offered to pay cash. Effectively cash. A check written before the auction opened, right now. He looked at Cassandra. Cassandra said clearly, without hesitation, $4,000. $2,500, Ethan said again, and he did not look at Cassandra. He looked at Darnell. "Sir," Darnell said, "the bid is $4,000. "The check is for $2,500, Ethan said. "I'm leaving at noon. Section G is not worth $4,000 to anyone in this room, and everyone here knows it." He paused. "You've got an interested buyer for a section that would otherwise go unsold, and she's offering you $4,000 for 17 vehicles she'll need to pay to transport and dispose of when she doesn't find what she's looking for. I'm offering you $2,500 for 17 vehicles that will be off your lot in 4 days. The room was now very quiet. Cassandra turned fully in her seat to look at Ethan, and something shifted slightly in her expression. Not quite anger, but its precursor. The controlled, careful recalibration of someone who has encountered unexpected resistance where none was expected. "Who are you?" Ethan looked at her for the first time. He had a direct kind of gaze, not unfriendly, but not given to softening. "Ethan Mercer. I have a garage in Copeland County." "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her voice had taken on the tone she probably used in boardrooms, measured, authoritative, carrying the implicit weight of everything behind it. "I'm prepared to pay $4,000 for this section. You're not going to outbid me. I'd suggest you save yourself the embarrassment and the mourning." "I'm not outbidding you," Ethan said. "I'm offering less. Different thing." Another ripple through the room. Gary Potts made a sound that was half-groan. Cassandra's jaw moved slightly, the way jaws move when their owners are deciding between several available responses. She settled on the direct one. "Mr. Darnell, proceed with the bid at $4,000. Darnell looked at Ethan. Ethan held up the check. He didn't say anything. What happened next was one of those moments that auctions occasionally produce, where the actual mechanics of commerce pause while everyone in the room absorbs a reality that doesn't match the normal operating logic. Darnell Weeks looked at the check. He looked at Cassandra Hale in her charcoal blazer. He looked at the section catalog in his hand, which described 17 vehicles worth approximately $3,500 in raw scrap, and which the auction house had estimated would sell for somewhere between nothing and $2,000 before the Escalade showed up. "I'm going to need a moment to consult with auction management," Darnell said. He stepped away from the podium. Cassandra turned back to the front. She picked up her phone and began typing something. Prentice leaned close and said something quiet and rapid that Ethan couldn't hear. Gary Potts leaned toward Ethan and said, very quietly, "What are you doing?" "Waiting," Ethan said. "She's going to win. She has more money." "She might." "So what's the play here?" Ethan looked at him. "There's no play. I want what's in Section G and I have $2,500. That's the situation." Gary stared at him. "That's your whole budget? $2,500? Ethan didn't answer. Darnell came back to the podium 3 minutes later. He had the expression of a man who had been told something he didn't entirely like but was going to do his job professionally regardless. "Given the circumstances," Darnell said carefully, "and given that the section has failed to attract competitive bidding beyond 2 parties, auction management has determined to accept a below-bid cash offer of $2,500, contingent on payment today and removal completion within 72 hours rather than the standard 30 days. The room produced a noise that was somewhere between confusion and collective incredulity. Cassandra's head turned sharply toward the side door where, presumably, auction management had retreated. Her mouth pressed to a thin line. "Sold," Darnell said. "Section G, $2,500. Buyer, see the office." Ethan stood up, tucked the check back in his jacket since he'd be writing a new one at the desk, and walked toward the auction office. He passed within 4 feet of Cassandra on the way out. She did not look at him, but her assistant, Prentice, did. And Prentice had the expression of someone who had just watched a man walk into traffic and survive. What happened in the next 18 hours was not something Ethan had any control over or particular interest in. Someone in the pavilion had filmed the exchange on a phone, the irregular bid, the face-off, Darnell's retreat to consult management, the final call, and posted it to a regional automotive forum with the caption, "Guy blows his life savings at Harlan County auction on 17 rusted heaps, talks down the CEO of Heartline Automotive, pays less than the going bid. What is wrong with people?" By midnight, the video had been shared to 3 separate Reddit communities. By 4 a.m., it was on 2 automotive YouTube channels with commentary. By 7 a.m. Thursday, it had been picked up by a mid-size entertainment aggregator under the headline, "This man spent his last $2,500 on 17 junk cars and lost a bidding war to a Fortune 500 CEO and still won?" The framing was confused because the situation itself was genuinely confusing to people who hadn't been there, and the comment sections reflected that confusion at significant volume. The dominant narrative, by a considerable margin, was mockery. Someone put their kid's college fund into a scrap pile. She walked away with her dignity intact at least. The definition of winning a battle and losing the war. This is what they call main character syndrome. The video had 2.3 million views by Thursday afternoon. Someone had edited a slow zoom on Ethan's face the moment he held up the check, expression unchanged, set to a melancholy piano piece that was popular in ironic internet contexts at the time. That version hit 1 million views on its own. Heartline Automotive's communications office received 3 media inquiry calls about the auction before close of business Thursday. Their standard response was no comment on ongoing matters, which was technically accurate in that Cassandra had immediately redirected her legal team to find other avenues to access Section G, which was now the property of one Ethan Mercer of Copeland County, Tennessee. Ethan, for his part, was not online Thursday. He was at the fairgrounds with a flatbed truck he'd borrowed from a friend named Del Hubbard, loading vehicles. Copeland County was not beautiful in the way places get described as beautiful in travel pieces. It was rural without being picturesque, the kind of landscape that had been worked rather than preserved, marked by the evidence of generations of practical effort. Old fencing, utility poles, equipment sheds with mismatched siding, fields that grew soybeans and corn in alternating years according to the same rotation the land had followed for decades. Ethan's garage sat on 2 acres off County Road 7, set back from the road behind a gravel drive that was rough enough to discourage casual visitors. The building itself was a converted agricultural structure, originally a large equipment barn, expanded twice over 30 years, now a working shop with 4 bays, a concrete floor that had been poured in sections over time, so it wasn't quite level in the transitions, a lift that was 12 years old and groaned on its way up, but had never failed, and an inventory of tools arranged with the kind of precision that comes from understanding the cost of not being able to find what you need. The exterior was unremarkable. Brown metal siding, a sign over the main door that read, "Mercer Auto" in white paint, the letters slightly uneven because Ethan had painted it himself 15 years ago and hadn't repainted it since. A gravel turnaround with room for 6 vehicles and usually 4 or 5 waiting for work at any given time. The whole operation had the appearance of modest, sustainable competence. Nothing flashy, nothing failing. By Thursday evening, 11 of the 17 vehicles from Section G were staged on the property. The remaining 6 were coming Friday morning with a second run of the flatbed. Ethan moved through the lot with a flashlight and a clipboard, making notes. Not value estimates. Not yet. Notes on condition, on what was there and what wasn't, on which items would need the most time before he could make proper assessments. He'd done this kind of preliminary survey dozens of times, and he moved through it quickly, not pausing at anything except Lot 34. He spent 20 minutes with Lot 34. The vehicle sat at the edge of the lot under a work light he'd strung from the barn eave. In better light than the auction grounds, certain details were more visible. The body line he'd traced with his thumb at the fairgrounds, the curve at the rear quarter, was cleaner than the rust made it appear. The proportions of the car, underneath the corrosion, were unusual. Production vehicles of its apparent era had certain dimensional standards. This car's wheelbase, its roof profile, the angle of the rear glass, none of it matched any production model he could confidently name. He crouched at the rear of the car and looked at what remained of a placard that had been riveted to the body inside the trunk opening. The rivet holes were there. The placard was long gone, probably removed deliberately, but the surface beneath where it had sat was cleaner than the surrounding metal, protected from oxidation by the placard itself for years before the placard was removed. He could make out, in the protected area, the ghost of a series of characters that had been embossed into the body itself, rather than printed on the placard. A stamped VIN, or production code, protected by something laid over it for long enough to matter. He photographed it with his phone camera. Then he straightened up and looked at the car for a long moment. His father, James Mercer, had spent 34 years in automotive engineering before his death 7 years ago. He had worked in the design and prototype divisions of 3 different manufacturers, including a 12-year stretch at a company that no longer existed as an independent entity, having been absorbed into a larger conglomerate in the late 80s. James Mercer had kept meticulous records of his work, not company property, nothing proprietary, but his own notebooks, his own sketches, his own documentation of projects he had worked on and how they had proceeded and what had come of them. Ethan had read those notebooks. He had read them more than once. There was one project in particular, a vehicle that had been developed over 4 years as a response to a specific government request, an experimental prototype designed to test a new kind of powertrain configuration that had never reached production. The project had been canceled. The prototype had been, officially, destroyed as part of the facility closure. James Mercer's notes from the last months of that project were among the most detailed he'd written. And in the final entries there was a passage that had stayed with Ethan for years. 3 units were completed before cancellation. 1 was tested to destruction per the protocol. 1 was dismantled for parts analysis. The 3rd, I don't know what became of the 3rd. I asked. They stopped answering questions about it. I think someone took it. I don't think it was destroyed. James Mercer had written that in 1989. He had never mentioned the project again, at least not in writing. Ethan looked at the car. He looked at the ghost of the stamped characters in the protected area where the placard had been. He thought about the Escalade at the Harlan County Fairgrounds and the way Cassandra Hale's assistant had photographed Section G with a professional camera while pretending not to be photographing it. He turned off the work light. He went inside, made a pot of coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table with one of his father's notebooks. The garage had a rhythm to it that Ethan had established over 15 years of sole operation. Mornings were for precision work, diagnosis, machining, assembly tasks that required full attention. Afternoons were for heavier work, body fabrication, structural repair. Evenings were for documentation, sourcing, the telephone calls and research that kept the operation moving. He ran the business alone except for one employee, a 23-year-old named Marcus Webb, who had started as a weekend helper at 17 and had stayed, who was competent and getting better, and who arrived each morning at 7:45 and left at 5, and was currently in the 2nd year of night classes at the community college studying mechanical engineering. Marcus arrived Friday morning to find the lot significantly transformed. "What is all this?" He stood in the gravel turnaround looking at the staged vehicles. "Auction by," Ethan said, coming out of the shop with 2 coffees. He handed one to Marcus. "Harlan County." Marcus walked the line slowly, looking at each vehicle. "You bought all of these?" 17 total, 6 more coming this morning. "What are they?" "Mostly what they look like. 1 or 2 worth restoring if the structure's sound. The rest will part out what's good and scrap what isn't." Marcus stopped at lot 34. He looked at it for a moment. This one looks like the worst of the bunch. It's first on the list, Ethan said. Marcus looked at him, then back at the car. You want me to start pulling it apart? No, I want you to leave it alone. I'll work that one personally. Okay. Marcus had been around Ethan long enough not to push the point. When Ethan said he'd handle something personally, it usually meant there was more to it than appeared. What do you want me on? The sedan in Bay 2. The frame's clean on that one and the drivetrain should be mostly sound. Somebody parked it when the timing belt went and never went back. Get it running and we'll see what we've got. Marcus nodded and went to work. The flatbed arrived at 9:15 with the remaining 6 vehicles, and by 10:30 the full lot of 17 was staged in the yard. Ethan walked the entire group one more time in the morning light, making his updated notes. Then he went to his desk, opened his laptop, and pulled up a legal database he paid a monthly subscription for and used every few months when a question of title or provenance needed careful attention. He spent the next 2 hours there. What he found, or more precisely, what he confirmed, gave him a specific kind of satisfaction, the kind that comes not from discovery, but from verification. The satisfaction of a thing you suspected being exactly what you suspected. He closed the laptop. He stood up and stretched and went back out to the shop, where Marcus had the sedan's timing cover off and was assessing the belt damage with the systematic calm of someone who had learned to look before touching. Marcus, Ethan said, Yeah. When you're done with the day, I want you to check the title on the 68 coupe out front, the green one. I think there's a clear path there, and it might be the first one we move. What are we asking for it? Ethan thought for a moment. Start at 52. Marcus looked up from the engine bay. 1,000? Yeah. For something out of that lot? For something out of that lot that I spent 2 days on and know is worth more than that, Ethan said. Yeah. Marcus looked at the lot through the open bay door. He did a brief mental calculation of the 17 vehicles staged outside, their apparent condition, the price Ethan had paid for all of them together. His expression said he was skeptical, but wasn't going to argue. All right, he said, and went back to work. So, on Friday evening, Ethan's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was from someone who identified herself as a paralegal at a firm called Gersten and Baird in Nashville, saying they represented a client interested in a vehicle from the recent Harlan County auction and asking that Ethan return the call at his earliest convenience. He didn't call back. On Saturday, there were 2 more calls from different numbers. One was another law firm. One was a private equity contact at a company he'd never heard of, leaving a message that managed to be both vague and vaguely threatening in a way that suggested its composer had some experience with vague threatening. On Sunday, a man showed up at the garage unannounced. Ethan was under lot 14, one of the other auction vehicles, a clean-framed muscle car that was going to need bodywork but had its numbers matching if you knew where to look. When he heard gravel crunching and boots approaching, he slid out from under the car. The man was in his mid-40s, suit jacket over open collar, expensive watch, the kind of haircut that required maintenance. He looked at the garage and the lot around it with the expression of someone who had expected to find something different and was recalibrating. Mr. Mercer? Yeah. My name is Brent Fowler. I work with Gersten and Baird. We reached out by phone. I know who you are, Ethan said. He stood up and wiped his hands on a shop rag. I didn't call back because I don't have anything to discuss. Fowler adjusted his expression to something more pleasant. We represent a client who has a significant interest in one of the vehicles you recently acquired, specifically the unit from Lot 34 of the Harlan County auction. Our client is prepared to make a very fair, "What's the vehicle worth to your client?" Fowler paused. I'm not in a position to... If you're not going to tell me what it's worth, there's no conversation to have, Ethan said. He bent down and slid back under Lot 14. There was a silence. Then, Mr. Mercer, I want to be direct with you. The vehicle has potential significance in an ongoing legal matter. Our client's position is that... Ethan's voice came from under the car. Did you drive out here from Nashville? Another pause. I did. You drove 2.5 hours to have a conversation I told you on the phone I didn't want to have? You didn't return our calls. That was the conversation, Ethan said. I'm busy. He heard Fowler stand there for another 30 seconds. He heard him walk back to the gravel. He heard the car door and the engine and the crunch of departure. He kept working. Yeah. That evening, after Marcus left, Ethan ate a sandwich standing at the kitchen counter and then went to his shop and pulled up the stool he kept next to his work table and sat down in front of Lot 34. He had not touched it yet. He'd been doing something he'd learned from his father, the practice of looking before acting, of letting your understanding of an object accumulate before you started doing anything irreversible to it. His father had called it reading the room, though the room in question was always an engine or a body or a system of some kind. Ethan looked at the car for a long time. He thought about his father's notebooks, about the third unit, the one that hadn't been destroyed, that had gone somewhere nobody would answer questions about. He thought about the Escalade and the professional camera and Cassandra Hale's expression when he'd made his irregular bid. He thought about Fowler driving 2.5 hours from Nashville to be dismissed in under 3 minutes. He thought about a number. The number in his father's final entry about the project. Not a dollar figure, but a project code. A series of characters that identified the specific prototype. He thought about the ghost of stamped characters he'd photographed in the protected area of Lot 34's trunk. He hadn't cross-referenced them yet. He was going to. He was going to sit with his father's notebooks and his phone photographs and work through it carefully, methodically, the way his father had taught him to work through any problem, with attention and without assumption. But he had a strong feeling about what he'd find. The kind of feeling that came not from hope, but from preparation. From 30 years of learning to read things that other people walked past without seeing. From inheriting, through long years of proximity, a particular way of paying attention to the world. Outside, the October wind moved through the trees at the edge of the property, and the gravel lot was dark except for the pole light at the corner of the building, and 17 vehicles sat in the Tennessee night, most of them junk, one of them maybe something else entirely. The internet was still laughing at Ethan Mercer, the fool who'd blown his savings on scrap metal. He turned off the light in the shop and went to bed. The notebooks were in a cardboard box under the workbench in the back corner of the shop, where they had been for 7 years. Ethan had put them there after his father's funeral and had not moved them since, though he had opened them many times. There were 11 of them, composition notebooks, the black and white marble kind, each one dated on the spine in James Mercer's tight, precise handwriting. The dates ran from 1974 to 2001, the year James retired from his last consulting position, 2 years before his diagnosis and 4 years before he died. The notebooks weren't diaries. James Mercer had not been a man who wrote about his feelings. They were working documents, records of problems encountered and solutions attempted, technical observations, sketches of mechanisms and systems, the accumulated notation of a man who believed that paying attention was a form of respect toward the work itself. Ethan brought the box to the kitchen table Sunday night and found the notebook he wanted, 1987 to 1989. He opened it to the back third, where the entries he'd been thinking about were clustered, and laid his phone beside it with the photographs he'd taken of the trunk area of Lot 34 open on the screen. His father's handwriting was small and did not waste space. The sketches in the margins were economical, just enough line to convey the shape, nothing decorative. Ethan had spent enough time with these notebooks that he could move through them quickly, finding the relevant passages the way you find your way through a familiar building in the dark. The project code appeared in the third entry from the back of the 1987 to 89 notebook. James had written it without explanation, the way you write something you already understand, a reference point, not a description. 7 characters, alphanumeric, followed by a dash and 2 digits that indicated the unit number. Ethan looked at the photographs on his phone. He zoomed in on the clearest image, the one he'd taken with the flash on, which had picked up the stamped characters in the protected metal with the most contrast. He looked for a long time. The characters were degraded. Some were partially obscured by surface corrosion that had crept under the edge of whatever had protected them. But 6 of the 7 were legible with certainty, and the 7th, the third character, which was either a 0 or the letter O, was consistent with what his father had written. He sat back in the chair. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved through the tall grass at the edge of the property with a sound like water, and somewhere in the distance, a loose piece of metal on the barn roof ticked against the structure in an arrhythmic pattern that Ethan had been meaning to fix for 2 years and kept not fixing. He closed the notebook. He did not feel the particular surge of vindication that people in movies feel when they confirm something large. What he felt was quieter than that, and more complicated. A kind of weight settling, the recognition that a thing he'd half-believed for years had turned out to be real, and that being real made it his problem in ways that being theoretical had not. He thought about his father, about the last entry in the notebook, the one about the third unit going somewhere nobody would answer questions about. James Mercer had written it without apparent bitterness, just documentation, the same tone he used for everything. But Ethan had always sensed something underneath it. Not anger exactly, more like the specific dissatisfaction of a craftsman who has made something carefully and then lost track of where it went. Ethan put the notebooks back in the box. He left the box on the table instead of returning it under the workbench. Then he went to bed and slept, because he had work in the morning. But the first vehicle he put real time into was not Lot 34. It was the 68 Coupe, Lot 11 in the auction catalog, a car he'd identified that first morning at the fairgrounds as having the best ratio of actual condition to apparent condition of anything in Section G. The body had surface rust but no structural rust, which was the only distinction that mattered. The drivetrain was complete and rebuildable. The interior was destroyed, but the framework was sound. He gave it 11 days. Marcus helped with the bodywork. He had good hands for it, patient and precise, had been learning the panel work for 2 years and was getting to the point where Ethan didn't need to check behind him on straightforward repairs. They stripped it, treated it, rebuilt the engine from the short block up, addressed the suspension, sourced correct era upholstery from a supplier in Georgia that Ethan had used for 20 years. The paint was a period-correct blue that took 3 days to get right because Ethan mixed the color himself from a formula in a reference he'd had since his 20s, and it took adjustment. When it was done, it looked like what it was, a 60-year-old car that had been properly restored rather than cosmetically dressed up. There was a difference, and anyone who knew the difference could see it immediately. Ethan put it on 2 listing platforms with photographs he took himself in the afternoon light on the gravel outside the barn. The description was exactly 40 words long. No superlatives, no florid language, just specifications and condition and contact information. The first call came in 4 hours after listing. The buyer was a collector from Louisville named Raymond Fisk, who drove down the following Saturday in a truck that suggested he moved cars regularly. He spent 40 minutes with the car, looked under it, pulled the valve covers, checked the door gaps, sat in it, and started it and listened, got out, and stood back and looked at it from various angles the way people do when they're trying to find reasons to negotiate. He didn't find many. "You do this yourself?" Fisk asked. "Me and my employee," Ethan said. "How long?" 11 days. Fisk looked at him. 11 days. The structure was sound. I didn't have to rebuild from nothing. Fisk walked around the car one more time. He crouched at the passenger rocker panel, looked at the weld seam, stood up. "You're at 52. "Yes." "I'll do 48. "I won't," Ethan said. A pause. 50. 52 is the number, Ethan said. "It's a fair number. If you think it isn't, I understand." Fisk looked at the car again. He had the expression of a man who was going to pay $52,000 and had already known he was going to pay $52,000 when he drove down from Louisville and was going through the motions of negotiation because not going through the motions felt like leaving something on the table. "Fine," Fisk said. 52. They shook hands. Fisk wrote a check. He loaded the car on his trailer, spent another 10 minutes talking to Ethan about the paint formula and the engine rebuild specs because he was that kind of buyer, and drove away. Ethan went back into the shop. Marcus was standing at the workbench pretending to organize tools. 52, Marcus said. 52. Marcus did the math out loud, involuntarily. You spent $2,500 on 17 cars, and the first one out the door went for $52,000. The work went for $52,000, Ethan said. The car was cheap. Marcus absorbed this. So the other 16, most of them won't go for that. The structure isn't there on everything, but a few more will go for real money. And the rust pile by the side door? Ethan looked at him. Lot 34 is not a rust pile. Okay, Marcus said carefully. What is it? It's something I'm going to work on by myself, Ethan said. Don't touch it, don't move it, don't let anyone look at it without asking me first. Marcus raised his hand slightly in a gesture of non-involvement. Got it. Ethan looked at the empty space in the lot where the blue coupe had been 2 hours ago. $52,000. He deposited the check that afternoon. The balance in his operating account, which had been at $2,300 before the auction, he'd written the bid check from personal savings, which had cleaned him out, was now at a number that gave him, for the first time in about 8 months, some room. Not comfort. Room. There was a difference. The legal pressure arrived in earnest the second week of November. What had been phone calls and one unannounced visit from a paralegal escalated into 2 letters from separate law firms and one hand-delivered document that turned out to be a formal inquiry from Heartline Automotive Group's in-house legal department, requesting that Ethan confirm the whereabouts and condition of certain property potentially acquired at auction, and asking him to refrain from any alteration, dismantling, or transfer pending further legal review. Ethan read the letter twice. Then he called a man named Gerald Tate. Gerald Tate was 63 years old, a semi-retired attorney who had practiced in Copeland County for 30 years before reducing his workload to a handful of clients he chose carefully. He had done work for Ethan before, a contract dispute with a restoration client 4 years ago, a title issue on a vehicle 2 years before that. He was not a fancy lawyer. He worked from an office above a dry goods store in downtown Millhaven and kept his files in manila folders and called his clients back the same day. They can't stop you from doing anything with property you legally purchased, Gerald said on the phone, after Ethan read him the letter. I know that, Ethan said. I wanted to know if there was anything in the language I was missing. The language is aggressive, but it's not actionable. They're trying to rattle you. A pause. Are you rattled? No? Then put the letter in a file and move on. If they file for an injunction, we'll deal with it. But this isn't that. This is a corporation that's used to people folding when they send letters on expensive stationery. Okay. What do they want from you exactly? What's in the vehicle? Ethan was quiet for a moment. I'm still figuring that out. Gerald made a sound that was neither accepting nor skeptical. He was a lawyer. He understood when a client was being precise rather than evasive. Whatever you figure out, don't do anything with it until you tell me first. I won't. After he hung up, Ethan sat at his desk for a minute. He thought about the letter and what it meant in practical terms. Not legally, he understood the legal situation clearly enough, but as a signal about the other side's level of investment. Heartline Automotive Group did not dispatch its in-house legal department to send hand-delivered letters to small-town mechanics without a reason proportional to the action. The letter told him more about the value of what he had than any appraisal could have. He went back to work. The second restored vehicle sold 3 weeks later. Lot 7, another muscle car, this one a late 60s two-door that had needed more structural work than the coupe, but had a cleaner drivetrain. Ethan spent 16 days on it. It sold to a buyer in Memphis for $38,000, which was under the coupe but above what anyone who'd seen Section G at the Harlan County auction would have believed possible. Word was beginning to get around in the collector community that something unusual was happening out of a shop in Copeland County, Tennessee. The automotive forums that had mocked Ethan's auction purchase in October were starting to generate different kinds of conversations. The earliest posts had been dismissive and comedic. By November, they had evolved into more ambivalent territory, the way internet opinion evolves when the evidence starts pointing somewhere inconvenient. Someone had done enough digging to post that the blue coupe had sold for $52,000, at which point the conversation split between people who believed it and people who insisted it couldn't be right. Ethan did not participate in any of these forums. He was aware they existed because Marcus, who was younger and could not entirely resist the internet, occasionally mentioned them, with a kind of proud discomfort, like someone whose relative is being talked about in public. They're saying the Memphis car went to a guy who paid $38,000 for it, Marcus said one morning in late November, standing in the bay doorway with his coffee. Did you see the offer that came in last night? Ethan asked. He was doing paperwork at the bench. The one from the dealer in Atlanta? Yeah. 22 for the convertible in Bay 3. Tell them no. Marcus looked at him. It's not done yet. When it's done, it'll be worth more than 22. Tell them no. They said 22 is a strong offer for the condition. I know the condition, Ethan said. Tell them to call back when it's finished. Marcus sent the email. The Atlanta dealer called back that afternoon, offering 25, and Ethan's position was the same. When the convertible was finished, 3 weeks later, after Ethan had rebuilt the carburetor 3 times because the first 2 attempts weren't right, after Marcus had spent 4 days on the chrome work that Ethan refused to let go to an outside shop, it sold for $41,000 to a buyer from Charlotte who had heard about the shop through the collector network and driven down to see it in person. You could have taken 25 3 weeks ago, Marcus said, watching the trailer pull out of the lot. I wasn't done 3 weeks ago. Still, $16,000 more doesn't seem worth an extra 3 weeks of work. Ethan considered this. He was not a man who explained himself habitually, but Marcus was asking something genuine and deserved a genuine answer. It's not about the $16,000, he said. If I sell something I'm not done with, then I put something unfinished into the world with my name on it. Then every time that car exists, it's the wrong version of it. That bothers me more than money. Marcus looked at the empty lot space. He seemed to be deciding whether this was wisdom or stubbornness. He probably correctly identified it as both. The second week of December brought a visitor Ethan had not expected. He'd had the regular pattern of lawyers and intermediaries, a call from Gersten and Baird, a follow-up letter from Heartline's legal department, a personal visit from a man who identified himself as a corporate acquisitions facilitator and who Ethan had sent away in under 2 minutes. He'd also had an approach from a different direction, a private collector named Ostergaard, who had apparently been tipped by someone in Heartline's orbit and who sent a handwritten note on heavy paper offering a significant and unspecified sum for the vehicle, with a phone number and the assurance that discretion would be maintained on all sides. Ethan didn't respond to Ostergaard either. What arrived in December was different. It was a woman in a sensible rental car, not an Escalade, not a town car, just a gray mid-sized sedan from whatever airport rental counter she'd used, who knocked on the open bay door at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning while Ethan was midway through pulling the heads on Lot 9. He heard the knock and slid out from under the vehicle and looked up and saw her standing in the doorway. She was in her mid-30s, dark coat, a laptop bag over one shoulder, and she had the look of someone who had driven some distance without a clear plan for what happened when they arrived. Mr. Mercer? Yeah. My name is Dana Rice. I'm a forensic accountant. She held up a business card, not moving closer, as if she understood she was on someone else's territory. I work independently. I'm not affiliated with Heartline. Ethan looked at the card without taking it. Who are you affiliated with? Currently? A law firm representing 4 former Heartline engineers in a class action relating to intellectual property theft and suppressed patent rights. It's been in federal court for about 11 months. She paused. Can I have a few minutes? Ethan looked at her. She didn't have the manner of the lawyers and facilitators who'd come before, the careful, calibrated friendliness designed to establish a working relationship before the ask arrived. She looked tired and was being direct, which he appreciated. Come in, he said. Don't touch anything. She stepped into the bay carefully, looking around at the organized workspace with what seemed like genuine curiosity rather than assessment. He gestured toward the bench at the back, and she sat on the stool there while he leaned against the workbench with his arms crossed. Tell me about the case, he said. She set the laptop bag on the bench. You know about Hartley Consolidated? The company that absorbed Meridian Motorworks in the late 80s. She looked at him. You know Meridian? My father worked there for 12 years. A pause. She opened the laptop bag and took out a folder rather than the laptop. Hartley absorbed Meridian in 1988. When they did, they acquired all of Meridian's intellectual property, patents, designs, prototype documentation, including a specific project. She found a document in the folder. Project designation 7-RX-04. A hybrid powertrain prototype developed over 4 years in response to a Department of Transportation feasibility study. 3 units completed. The project was canceled when Meridian was absorbed because Hartley's board had competing technology they wanted to protect. Ethan said nothing. Here's the thing, Dana said. Hartley Consolidated became Heartline Automotive Group through a series of mergers over the following decade. In 2019, Heartline filed a series of patents for a new powertrain technology that their current engineers developed. 4 of those patents, not the core technology, but 4 specific mechanical configurations, are, according to the engineers we represent, substantially derived from the 7RX04 prototype documentation. Derived without attribution, without compensation to the original design team, and without disclosure that the technology had a prior development history. The engineers who worked on 7-RX-04, Ethan said, some of them, the ones still living, their families in some cases. She looked at him steadily. Your father worked on that project. He did. He passed away, I know. I'm sorry. She meant it, he thought. It had the weight of something said rather than deployed. His estate would be a party if... She stopped herself. That's not why I'm here exactly. I'm not here to recruit you. I'm here because our legal team believes that the physical prototype, if it still exists, would be significant evidentiary support. The patent dispute right now is documentation versus documentation. Heartline's lawyers are very good at documentation. Ethan was quiet for a moment. What does physical evidence change? A prototype is a prior art artifact. If the vehicle exists and our engineers can demonstrate that the specific configurations in Heartline's patents were physically present in the 7RX04 design, tangibly present, not just in documents that Heartline's attorneys can challenge as incomplete or misremembered, it changes the evidentiary landscape of the case considerably. She paused. Our filing deadline for supplemental evidence is February 14th. After that, what we have is what we go to trial with. Ethan looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Dana Rice. How did you find me? The auction was public record. The video made it more findable. A slight compression at the corner of her mouth that was close to a smile but not quite. We did research on every vehicle in Section G when we became aware of the auction. The 7RX04 units had distinguishing structural characteristics. Lot 34's catalog photograph was ambiguous but not eliminable. When Heartline's legal team started making contact with you, that told us something. Yeah, Ethan said. He understood the logic. Heartline's level of interest was its own form of confirmation. Have you examined the vehicle? Some. Can you confirm what it is? He looked at her. I can confirm that it's consistent with what it would need to be. I haven't done a full forensic examination. She nodded. She wasn't going to push past that, and he appreciated it. I want to be straightforward with you, Mr. Mercer, she said. We can't tell you what to do with property you legally own, and I'm not going to make the argument that you have an obligation to this case because of your father's involvement. That's emotional pressure, and you can decide for yourself how much it matters to you. What I can tell you is that there are 4 engineers and the families of 2 others who have been fighting this for 3 years, and they're running out of runway. What do they want from the vehicle? Access for examination, possibly testimony about your acquisition. We're not asking you to give it up. We'd want it examined by our forensic engineering team with documentation, then returned to you. And Heartline? Heartline wants to buy it, she said, or bury it. Probably the first one is a path to the second. She said it flatly, without drama, just her assessment of the situation. Ethan looked at the bay door. Outside, the December light was flat and gray, the lot quiet, Marcus having taken the truck to a parts supplier 20 miles away. Lot 34 sat at the corner of the yard where he'd staged it that first week, covered now with a canvas tarp he'd staked down at the edges. Leave your card, he said. She left it. She gathered her folder and her bag and stood up from the stool. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. The video from the auction, the one that went around. You made that bid knowing what Heartline was there for, didn't you? Ethan considered whether to answer. I had a theory. They think you stumbled into it. I know what they think. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between reassessment and respect. Then she walked to the bay door and turned back once. February 14th, she said. I heard you the first time, Ethan said. Come. After she left, he stood in the bay for a while without moving. The shop was quiet in the mid-morning way it got when Marcus was gone. Just the sound of the building settling, the wind outside, the faint smell of oil and metal that was so constant Ethan usually didn't notice it, but noticed it now. He went to his father's box on the kitchen table and opened it. He found the 1987 to 89 notebook again and turned to the final entry about the project. His father had written, "I don't know what became of the third. I asked. They stopped answering questions about it. I think someone took it. I don't think it was destroyed." There was something underneath that entry, a single additional line written later in different ink, which suggested his father had returned to the page at some point after the original notation. If it surfaces someday, whoever finds it will need to know what to look for. And below that, in the same second ink, a list of 9 structural and mechanical characteristics. Specific, technical, the kind of detail that only someone who had worked on the vehicle could know. Not obvious things, subtle things. The kind of markers that distinguish the prototype from a production vehicle dressed to look like one. Ethan had read this entry many times. He had read it again 2 months ago when he was preparing for the auction. He had read it with the cold attention of someone filing information they might need, not with sentimentality, because sentimentality wasn't useful. But sitting here now, with Dana Rice's card on the table and the February deadline in his head, he read it differently. His father had written those 9 characteristics. His father had written them understanding that he wouldn't be the one to find the vehicle, understanding maybe that the knowledge needed to survive him, needed to go somewhere. It had gone to Ethan. Through 11 composition notebooks in a cardboard box under a workbench, through 30 years of proximity to the work, through the accumulated transfer of one man's understanding to another in the slow, patient way that things are actually taught. Not in classrooms or formal instruction, but in presence, in repetition, in the long unspoken education of watching someone you trust move through the world. He closed the notebook. He looked at Dana's card. He thought about February 14th. Then he went back to the bay and got back under lot 9, because the heads weren't going to pull themselves, and he had a customer expecting the vehicle by the end of the month. The confrontation he had been anticipating differently arrived on a Thursday in mid-December. It was not another paralegal or a facilitator or a forensic accountant. It was a man named Clifton Reeves, who introduced himself as Heartline's Senior Vice President of Strategic Acquisitions, and who arrived in the kind of company vehicle that announces corporate investment without being ostentatious, a well-appointed SUV, not a limousine. Reeves was in his early 50s, silver at the temples, the kind of steady, practiced manner that suggested he spent his working life solving problems that other people had failed to solve by being less steady and less practiced. He knocked on the bay door at 2 p.m. He introduced himself clearly and offered a handshake. Ethan shook it. He pulled a second stool over to the bench. "You came yourself," Ethan said. "The situation warranted it," Reeves said. "I want to be direct with you, Mr. Mercer. The correspondence we've sent has been formal. That was appropriate for the early stages. I think we're past the early stages." "Okay." "Heartline has a significant legal matter pending. I don't think that's news to you. We believe a vehicle in your possession may be material to our case." He paused. "We'd like to acquire it." "What are you offering?" Reeves opened a folder. $150,000. Clean transaction, no encumbrance, title and possession transferred within 30 days of agreement. It was a real number. Ethan had expected Heartline to come in with a real number eventually, because real numbers had been their method throughout. Escalating investment, each stage proportional to the previous stage's failure to produce results. 150,000 was the next logical step. He also knew that if the vehicle was what he believed it was, and if Dana Rice's assessment of the legal situation was accurate, Heartline's motivation was not to use the vehicle as evidence. Their motivation was to make it unavailable. "No," Ethan said. Reeves absorbed this without expression. "Can I ask why not?" "You can ask." A beat. "Why not, Mr. Mercer?" "Because 150,000 is what it's worth to you to make it disappear," Ethan said. "That's not the same thing as what it's worth." Reeves recrossed his legs. He had the air of someone adjusting a strategy rather than being derailed. "We could go higher. I'm authorized to—" "It's not about the number," Ethan said. This produced a slightly longer pause. What is it about? Ethan looked at him. There are people who worked on that vehicle for 4 years. Engineers who built something and then watched the company that owned their work get absorbed, and watched the new company bury the project, and now they're watching a version of their work show up in patents 30 years later without their names on it. He paused. One of them was my father. Reeves was quiet. I'm not saying you did it, Ethan said. I'm not saying you knew. I don't know what you knew, but I know what the vehicle is and I know what it means, and I'm not selling it to you for $150,000 so it can end up in a facility somewhere being unavailable. Mr. Mercer, Reeves said carefully, Heartline's position in the legal matter is that the engineering team's claims are not substantiated by the available documentation. The vehicle is documentation, Ethan said. Better documentation than paper. He stood up. I appreciate you coming in person. It was the right call, but the answer is no. Reeves sat for a moment. He had the expression of a man who had delivered bad news before and would need to deliver it again. He closed the folder, stood, offered his hand again. Ethan shook it again. If you change your mind, Reeves said. I won't, Ethan said, but I appreciate the courtesy. After the SUV was gone, Marcus appeared from Bay 2 where he had been very quietly doing very careful work on the convertible's chrome trim. Was that Heartline? He asked. Yeah. What did they want? Same thing everyone wants. Ethan looked at the tarp-covered shape at the edge of the lot. To buy something that isn't for sale. Marcus looked at the tarp. He'd been working here 3 months since the auction, and he'd watched lawyers come and go, and a forensic accountant show up in a rental car and a senior vice president of something leave without whatever he'd come for. He'd also watched Ethan sell 3 vehicles for a combined total that had quietly transformed the operation's financial situation from anxious to stable. Can I ask you something? Marcus said. Yeah. That car under the tarp. Are you going to fix it? Yeah. What happens after that? Ethan looked at him. It was a genuinely good question, and the answer was still assembling itself in his head. Not uncertain, exactly, but not yet complete. There was a difference between knowing what you were going to do and knowing the shape of what doing it would require. Something fair, Ethan said. Marcus considered this. He seemed to decide that it was an answer, even if not a complete one. Okay, he said, and went back to the chrome work. Outside, the December wind moved through Copeland County without particular interest in what it passed, and under the canvas tarp at the edge of the gravel lot, Lot 34 sat in the cold, patient, unchanged, carrying the accumulated weight of 4 years of work and 30 years of absence, and a single notebook entry written by a man who understood that some things needed to survive their makers. January moved through Copeland County the way January always did, gray and deliberate, the cold settling into the ground rather than hanging in the air, the kind of weather that didn't announce itself dramatically, but simply persisted. The trees along County Road 7 were bare, and the fields on either side of Ethan's property were the color of old straw, and the sky on most mornings was the flat white of paper that hadn't been written on yet. Ethan started on Lot 34 the first week of January. He'd spent the last 3 weeks of December finishing 2 more vehicles from the auction lot. Lot 6, a pre-muscle era coupe that needed more work than it appeared but had a clean history, and Lot 12, a small pickup that Ethan had almost scrapped until Marcus found the frame rails intact under what looked like advanced rust. Both sold before Christmas, Lot 6 to a collector in Atlanta who paid $29,000 without negotiating, Lot 12 to a man in Knoxville who paid $17,000 and seemed almost embarrassed to pay so little for something so well done. The operation's finances had moved from stable to something approaching solid. Not wealthy, not even comfortable by most standards, but the kind of solid where you stop calculating the checking account before making decisions and start just making decisions. He had also spoken to Dana Rice twice more by phone, once in late November and once in the second week of December, and to Gerald Tate 3 times, and had received 2 more written communications from Heartline's legal department that Gerald had assessed as increasingly urgent in tone and increasingly lacking in legal substance, which Gerald said was a bad combination in his experience because it meant the party sending them was running out of options and starting to substitute volume for strategy. The February 14th deadline was 42 days away when Ethan pulled the tarp off Lot 34 for the last time. He did it early in the morning before Marcus arrived, in the pale flat light before the sun was fully up. He folded the canvas carefully and set it on the workbench inside. Then he stood in the cold and looked at the car in the open air without the tarp for the first time since he'd covered it in October. It looked exactly as it had looked then. He hadn't expected otherwise. Rust didn't improve on its own. He walked around it once, slowly. He'd done this dozens of times, but the first walk of a working session was always different from the observation sessions. It was the shift from reading to beginning, and there was something in that shift that required its own attention. He put his hand on the roof, not to inspect it, but just to make contact, the way you might touch a shoulder before starting a difficult conversation. "All right," he said quietly, to nothing in particular, and went inside to get his tools. Chat. The disassembly took 4 days. He worked methodically, logging everything as he went. Not just condition notes, but documentation that would serve an evidentiary purpose if it came to that. He photographed each component before removal, tagged and bagged hardware in labeled containers, kept a running written inventory that was more thorough than anything he'd produced for a commercial restoration. He understood that this vehicle existed in 2 registers simultaneously. It was a mechanical object that needed to be understood on its own terms, and it was a legal artifact that might need to survive scrutiny by people whose interest was adversarial. His father's 9 characteristics were in his head from memory. He didn't need the notebook open in front of him, though he referenced it at the end of each day to confirm what he'd found against what James had documented. The first characteristic was confirmed on the first day, a specific configuration of the lower control arm mounting points that differed from any production vehicle of the era. It was subtle, a matter of geometry, the angle of the mount offset by 11 degrees from standard, which produced a handling characteristic that had been intentional, documented in his father's notes as a designed response to a specific stability requirement in the original government brief. The second and third characteristics, relating to the firewall structure and a specific routing of the cooling system, were confirmed on day 2. By the end of day 4, when he had the car stripped to its essential structure and the powertrain components laid out on clean workbench cloth in the order of their removal, he had confirmed 7 of his father's 9 characteristics, and had found 3 additional distinguishing markers that James hadn't listed, either because he hadn't thought them notable or because he documented them elsewhere in materials Ethan didn't have. The 7th characteristic was the one that stopped him. It was in the powertrain configuration, a specific mechanical interface between the combustion and electrical components that was, even by current standards, elegant in its simplicity. His father had written about it in the notebooks in language that was as close to admiring as James Mercer's technical writing ever got. "The integration is cleaner than anything I've seen from the outside. Whoever designed it understood that the solution was in reducing the interface, not elaborating it. I wish I'd thought of it." Ethan stood over the laid-out components for a long time. He understood what he was looking at, not just the mechanical reality, but the human reality behind it. Someone had spent years on this, multiple someones. They had worked out a solution to a problem that the industry was still circling 30 years later, and the solution had been canceled, absorbed, buried, and then, according to Dana Rice and the engineers she represented, quietly retrieved from the burial and filed under a different name. He took a long series of photographs. He made detailed notes. Then he covered everything with clean drop cloths and went inside and called Gerald Tate. "I need you to set up a meeting," Ethan said. "With Dana Rice's team?" "With Heartline. I want to talk to whoever makes decisions there, not their legal department and not their acquisitions people." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "You've been turning them away for 3 months. What changed?" "Nothing changed. I know what I have now." He paused. "I knew before. But now I can prove it, and that changes what the conversation is. What do you want from the meeting?" "To make a deal. On my terms." Another pause, longer this time. Gerald was a man who thought before he spoke, which was why Ethan had kept him as his lawyer for 8 years. "You understand that Heartline's terms and your terms are probably not going to start in the same room." "I know. And you understand that if they feel like they can't make a deal, they might try a different approach. Legal challenge to your title, argument that the vehicle was improperly sold, that proper disclosure wasn't made by the estate, something along those lines." The title is clean, Ethan said. I've been through it. Clean isn't bulletproof when the other side has resources to make it complicated. I know that too, Ethan said. That's why I want to meet before February 14th rather than after. After the deadline, their position changes. Before it, they still need me. Gerald absorbed this. You've been thinking about this for a while. Since October, Ethan said, a sound that might have been a short laugh. All right, let me make some calls. Who at Heartline do you want? Ethan had thought about this. Not Fowler, the paralegal, not Reeves, the acquisitions VP, who was a capable man but who operated within a defined negotiating mandate that would limit the conversation before it started. The person he wanted was the person who had come to Harlan County herself, rather than sending representatives who had made the bid personally, rather than through Prentice, who had, whatever her reasons, shown up. Cassandra Hale, he said. Gerald let out a longer breath. The CEO. Yes. You're asking me to get a meeting with the chief executive of a multi-billion-dollar company to discuss a vehicle you bought for $2,500 at a county auction. She was at the auction, Ethan said. She knows what it is. I don't want to spend 3 meetings getting someone up to speed before I can have the real conversation. She's going to have lawyers with her. That's fine. Bring yours. Ethan, Gerald said, with the particular tone he used when he was being a friend rather than a lawyer. Are you sure about this? Yeah. Because what you're describing is walking into a room with one of the most powerful people in American automotive, with property they very much want, and telling them what the terms are. That requires a certain kind of confidence. I know what I have, Ethan said again. That's enough. Gerald made the calls. It took 9 days to arrange. Heartline's office pushed back twice on the venue. They wanted Nashville, their offices, their territory. And Ethan declined both times without drama, which was a response Heartline's people didn't seem to have a prepared counter to. They settled on a neutral location, a conference room at a law office in Murfreesboro, 40 minutes from Ethan's shop, equidistant from Nashville. The meeting was set for January 22nd, a Thursday, at 10 a.m. Ethan drove himself. He wore what he wore. Clean canvas jacket, good jeans, work boots that he'd actually cleaned for the occasion, which was as far as he was going to go. Gerald had suggested a suit, and Ethan had declined without explanation, and Gerald, knowing him, had not pressed. He arrived 8 minutes early. Gerald was already there, having driven from Mill Haven, standing in the lobby of the law office with a yellow legal pad and the slightly over-alert expression of a man who was preparing to be outgunned and intended to compensate with preparation. They're already here, Gerald said quietly as Ethan came through the door. 3 of them. Hale, their general counsel, woman named Cho, and an IP specialist from an outside firm. No Reeves. Reeves was there to buy, Ethan said. This isn't a purchase meeting. What kind of meeting is it? Ethan considered the question. A negotiation, he said, but not about price. Gerald looked at him with the expression of a man who would understand that more fully in about 20 minutes and was willing to wait. They went in. The conference room was standard law office. Long table, leather chairs, water pitchers. The particular silence of a room that had heard a lot of difficult conversations and absorbed them without visible damage. Cassandra Hale was at the far end of the table, which placed her with her back to the window in a position that was either instinctive or deliberate, and probably both. She was in a different blazer than the one she'd worn at the auction. Charcoal had become navy. And her expression was the same composed, slightly forward-angled attention that Ethan remembered from the pavilion. She looked different here than she had at the auction. At the fairgrounds, she'd been the largest presence in the room, operating on home ground in the sense that her resources and authority were the dominant feature of the environment. Here, in a neutral conference room, without the social architecture of the auction working in her favor, she looked, not smaller, that wasn't the right word, more specific, more present as an actual person. The woman to her left was compact and watchful, with close-cropped hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. General Counsel Cho, Ethan assumed. The man to her right was younger, with a stack of folders and a laptop, and the particular coiled attention of someone whose expertise was being tested. Gerald set his legal pad on the table. Ethan sat down. Nobody did the opening pleasantry dance for very long. Cassandra Hale was not a pleasantry extended past utility kind of person, which Ethan had assessed at the auction and confirmed now. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "you requested this meeting." "I did. Our understanding is that you're prepared to discuss a transaction regarding the vehicle from Section G of the Harlan County auction, Lot 34. "That's right." She glanced at the IP specialist, something communicative passing between them that Ethan couldn't read precisely but understood generally. They had a number prepared, probably higher than Reeves had offered, probably significantly higher. "Before we discuss terms," Ethan said, "I want to show you something." He opened the folder he'd brought. His folder, manila, the same kind Gerald used, and slid a set of photographs down the table toward Cassandra. She looked at them. Cho leaned in. The IP specialist reached for one. The photograph showed the stripped powertrain components laid out on the workbench cloth, each piece tagged and labeled, and a series of close-up images of specific configurations with handwritten measurements notated beside them. They showed the lower control arm mounting geometry, the firewall structure, the cooling system, routing. They showed the stamped characters in the protected area of the trunk. And they showed, on the last page, which Ethan had spent 2 hours formatting carefully the night before, a side-by-side comparison of the 7 confirmed characteristics from his father's notebook against the corresponding elements in 2 of Heartline's 2019 patent filings, with the specific figures and claims numbered. Cassandra looked at this last page for a long time. "Where did you get the patent comparison?" Cho asked. Her voice was measured, professional, carefully not alarmed. "Patent filings are public," Ethan said. "The comparison is my own work. And the characteristics list? My father's documentation from his time at Meridian." The room was quiet. Cassandra looked up from the photographs. Something had shifted in her expression. Not dramatically, she was too controlled for that, but there was a quality to her attention now that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. The difference between someone listening and someone recalibrating. "My father worked on the 7-RX-04 project for 2 years, Ethan said. He kept detailed notes. He documented what he worked on, what the design parameters were, what solutions were found. He paused. He also documented that the third prototype was never destroyed, that it went somewhere. He spent some time wondering where. "Mr. Mercer," Cho said carefully, "I want to be clear that Heartline's position regarding our 2019 patent filings is, I'm not interested in Heartline's position," Ethan said, not unkindly but directly. "I'm interested in having a straight conversation about what I have and what it means." He looked at Cassandra. "Can we have that conversation?" A pause. Then Cassandra said to Cho, "Give us a few minutes." Cho looked at her. A small exchange of something, not disagreement, more like a professional's instinct to stay in the room, warring briefly with the recognition that her principal had made a decision. She nodded, gathered her notepad, and she and the IP specialist left. Gerald, after a glance at Ethan, followed them out, closing the door behind him. Ethan and Cassandra were alone in the conference room. She looked at the photographs again. She picked up the comparison page and read it carefully in a way that suggested she was understanding the technical content, not just registering its existence. Ethan waited. "How long have you known what it was?" she said, without looking up. "I had a strong theory before the auction," he said. "I confirmed it over the last 3 months." "You knew at the fairgrounds." "I suspected." She set the page down. "That bid," she said. "The 2,500. You weren't at your limit." "No. You were making a point." "I was buying 17 cars for the amount I had," Ethan said. "The rest was between you and the auction house." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't categorize quickly. It was somewhere between assessment and something more complicated that he didn't yet have a name for. "You don't work like anyone I've dealt with before." "I'm a mechanic," he said. "I don't work like the people you usually deal with." A silence. Not uncomfortable exactly, more like the silence of 2 people who have established that they are actually in the same room. "What do you want for it?" she said. "2 things." She didn't move. "First," Ethan said, "fair market value. Not the number your acquisitions team put together, not a number that reflects how useful it is to Heartline's legal position. Fair market value for a confirmed prototype of demonstrated historical and technical significance in original condition. I want that number established by an independent appraiser that both sides agree on. Cassandra was quiet. This was not what she'd expected, Ethan could tell. Not because she reacted strongly, but because she didn't react at all, which in someone of her control meant the input was being processed rather than filed. "What's the second thing?" she said. "A vocational restoration program," Ethan said. "Endowed. Not a one-time grant, a permanent endowment, structured so it continues regardless of what happens to Heartline's business situation in any given year. Minimum of $3 million in the initial endowment. The program funds training for restoration craftspeople. Young people who want to learn this work but can't access it because the economics don't support traditional apprenticeship anymore." The silence this time was longer. "That's an unusual condition for a vehicle sale," Cassandra said. "I know. You could take the money from the sale and fund it yourself." "With what Heartline pays for a single prototype?" Ethan said. "Yes. I could fund something small, a few years of programming, but you could fund something that lasts, and I want something that lasts." She looked at him. "Why?" It was the right question, and he'd known it was coming, and he'd spent some time deciding how honest he was going to be when it did. "My father gave me everything I know," he said. "Not formally. He didn't sit me down and teach me. It was just proximity. Watching him work, being in the shop, having him correct me when I was wrong and not say anything when I was right. That's how this knowledge moves. It requires time and proximity and the willingness to pay attention over years." He paused. "That kind of transmission is dying because nobody can afford to do it anymore. A kid who wants to learn restoration either has family money or they go to a technical school that teaches them to work on new cars. The specific knowledge, how old things were actually built, what the materials do, how to read what happened to something over decades, that dies when the people who have it die. My father's gone. Most of his generation is gone. What's left is in books and notebooks and in the heads of maybe a few hundred people in this country." He stopped. "The program doesn't change that completely, but it changes it some." Cassandra was still looking at him. He couldn't read her expression now. It had moved past the categories he'd been applying to it since she walked in. "You came to a business meeting," she said slowly, "to tell me about your father." "I came to a business meeting to make a deal," Ethan said. "My father is why the terms are what they are." She stood up, not in a leaving way. She walked to the window, stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the parking lot below. It was an oddly private gesture from someone who kept herself very buttoned up, and Ethan let it be what it was. "The legal situation," she said to the window. "You know what happens if the plaintiff's case succeeds. I have a general picture. It's not just the patents. A judgment would trigger a review of everything Heartline acquired in the Hartley merger. The scope of the exposure is—" She stopped. "It's significant." "I know. And you're not moved by that." "It's not my problem," Ethan said. "How Heartline handles its legal situation is Heartline's problem. What I'm offering you is a legitimate path to the vehicle. What you do with it is your decision." She turned from the window. "If we give the engineer's legal team access to the vehicle for examination, our position in the case changes." "Yes." "You understand we'd be handing them their best evidence." "That's between you and your counsel," Ethan said. "I'm not telling you to give them access. I'm telling you that the vehicle exists, and I know what it is, and you're not going to buy it away from me on the cheap and make it disappear. Whatever happens in that courtroom, it happens with accurate information." He paused. "That's all I'm asking for, accurate information." The silence this time was the longest yet. Cassandra stood by the window and Ethan sat at the conference table, and the water pitchers on the table reflected the pale January light from outside, and nobody said anything for a while. "You've had 3 months to sell this to someone else," she said finally. "Dana Rice's clients would have paid." "Probably. Or you could have taken Reeves's offer. $150,000 clears your debt and sets you up for a year." "I know. Why didn't you?" Ethan thought about how to say the next thing accurately. Because fair isn't complicated, he said. It just requires not taking shortcuts. He looked at the photographs still spread on the table. Your engineers, the ones in the lawsuit, the ones who built this thing, they didn't get what was fair. And that happened because somewhere in a merger 30 years ago, someone decided fair was less important than convenient. I don't want to be the next person who decides that. Cassandra sat back down at the table. She sat across from him now, not at the end. She'd moved, he noticed, without apparently deciding to. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him. I mocked you, she said, at the auction. I heard. I said you destroyed your future. I remember. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite discomfort, but was related to it. I made a judgment about who you were from 20 seconds of observation in a place I didn't want to be, about a transaction I didn't understand. You didn't have the information, Ethan said. I had enough information to know I didn't have all of it. A pause. That's the mistake. Not the conclusion, the certainty about the conclusion. He looked at her. This was not a conversation he'd expected to be having, and he suspected it wasn't one she'd expected to be having either. There was something disarming about it. The specific disarmament that comes when someone gives an honest accounting of themselves rather than a performance of accountability. You didn't have the context, he said. I grew up in it. That's generous? It's accurate, he said. There's a difference. She almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but the elements were there. I need to bring my counsel back in, she said. Okay. And I need to make some calls before I can confirm anything. Take the time you need, Ethan said. The deadline is February 14th. I'm in Copeland County every day. She stood again and looked at the photographs one more time. She picked up the comparison page, his side-by-side of the prototype characteristics and the patent claims, and looked at it with the focused attention she'd given it before. Who else has seen this? She said. Gerald. Dana Rice knows the vehicle exists and knows what it is. She hasn't seen my documentation. If we reach an agreement, she said carefully, what happens to your documentation? It stays mine, he said. What I do with it is my decision, but I'm not a weapons dealer. I'm a mechanic. If Heartline comes to the table honestly, there's no reason for me to go looking for other uses for what I know. She set the page down. That's not a legal commitment. No, he said. It's my word. You can decide what that's worth. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went to the door and opened it, and Cho and the IP specialist came back in, and Gerald, who had been in the hallway trying to look like he hadn't been listening, though Ethan suspected he'd heard more than he'd admit. The formal negotiation resumed. Cho's careful language, the IP specialist's numbered references to patent figures, Gerald's patient reiteration of Ethan's two conditions. Ethan mostly watched. He watched Cassandra, specifically, how she managed the room, how she listened when Cho spoke, when she was genuinely taking information in versus when she was waiting for the other person to finish. He was revising his understanding of her in real time, the way you revise your understanding of an engine when you get it apart, and the actual mechanism is different from what the exterior suggested. She was sharp, that he'd known from the auction, but she was also, he was finding, more honest than people in her position usually needed to be. She didn't deflect the difficult moments. When Cho tried to reframe one of Ethan's conditions as a liability, Cassandra said simply, "Let him finish," and waited. When the IP specialist suggested that the patent comparison Ethan had produced was interpretive, Cassandra looked at the page herself and said, "It's not interpretive. The configuration match is visible to anyone who understands the engineering." The IP specialist went quiet. The session ran until nearly 1 p.m. Nothing was finalized. Cassandra said she needed to consult with Heartline's board on the endowment condition, which was true, Ethan knew, and not a stall. A $3 million endowment required fiduciary process regardless of willingness. They agreed to reconvene within 10 days. As the room cleared, Cho and the IP specialist heading out, Gerald gathering his legal pad, Cassandra paused at the door. "The program," she said, "the vocational restoration program. Do you have a structure in mind?" "Outlines," he said, "nothing Nothing formal. When we reconvene, bring them. The board will want to see that there's a workable model before they approve the endowment. It was practical advice given straight, without condescension. He recognized it as the same thing, the same quality, that had made her come to Harlan County herself. She went where the real thing was. "I will," he said. She left. Gerald appeared at Ethan's shoulder and stood there for a moment. "Well," Gerald said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "That went differently than I expected." Ethan picked up his folder. "How did you expect it to go?" "More like a fight," Gerald said. "More attorneys at 10 paces. Less—" He gestured at the empty room. "She's not what I expected either," Ethan said. "She agreed to your terms?" "She agreed to consider them. That's different." He looked at the table where the photographs had been. "But she'll come back. She's not done." Gerald made his sound of cautious assessment. "What makes you sure?" Ethan thought about the way she'd looked at the comparison page, the way she'd said plainly, "It's not interpretive," the way she'd asked about the program's structure and told him to bring outlines. "Because she wants to fix it," he said. "She might not know that's what she wants yet, but she does." Gerald looked at him for a moment. "You know," he said, "for a man who works on cars, you read people pretty well." "My father taught me to read things," Ethan said. He didn't specify what kind. They walked out together into the parking lot, into the gray January cold, and Ethan drove back to Copeland County with the heater running and the radio off, thinking about endowments and outlines and the specific geometry of a lower control arm mount offset by 11 degrees, and the way some solutions were elegant precisely because they reduced the interface rather than elaborating it. The 10 days between the first meeting and the reconvening were the longest kind of waiting, the kind where you've done what you can do and the next move belongs to someone else. Ethan filled them the way he always filled time, with work. He had 8 vehicles left from the auction lot, including Lot 34, which he'd stripped and documented but not yet begun to restore. He turned his attention to 3 others in sequence, Lot 3, Lot 8, and Lot 15, moving through them with the particular efficiency of someone whose mind is partially elsewhere, but whose hands know what they're doing independently. Marcus noticed the pace. "You're working faster than usual," he said on the 3rd day. "I'm working the same," Ethan said. "You did that carburetor in 2 hours. You usually spend half a day on that configuration." "I've done that configuration 40 times. Marcus let it go, but 2 days later he said, "The meeting go okay?" Ethan looked up from the workbench. "Yeah." "Did they agree to your thing?" "They're thinking about it." "What if they say no?" Ethan went back to the part in his hand. "Then I figure out the next step." "What is the next step if they say no?" "I don't know yet," Ethan said honestly. "But there's always a next step. The only situation without a next step is when the problem's solved." Marcus absorbed this. "That's either really optimistic or really practical, and I can't tell which." "Both," Ethan said. "Same thing, mostly." He drafted the program outlines in the evenings, at the kitchen table, with his father's notebooks beside him. Not for reference exactly, more for company. He wrote in plain language, not grant language, because he didn't know grant language and wasn't going to pretend to. What he described was specific, a 2-year residency program for people between 18 and 30 who wanted to learn traditional restoration craft. Small cohorts, 6 people at a time. Working restoration projects, not classroom exercises. Instruction from practitioners, not from people who had studied practitioners. Completion requirements tied to demonstrable competency rather than contact hours. He wrote about what the work required. The patience, the attention, the willingness to learn from objects rather than from explanations of objects. The specific education of touching a thing and understanding it through contact rather than through description. He didn't write about his father directly, but he wrote about what his father had given him in the plain terms of craft and transmission, and anyone reading carefully would understand what was underneath it. He printed 12 pages and put them in a folder and left the folder on the passenger seat of his truck. On January 31st, Gerald called. "Heartline's board approved the endowment," he said. $3.2 million, slightly above your minimum. The additional $200,000 is for administrative infrastructure in the first 2 years. Their idea, apparently. The independent appraiser condition is accepted. They've proposed a name. A firm in Atlanta that does heritage vehicle assessments. They've sent me credentials. Ethan was standing in the bay. He leaned against the doorframe. What's the appraiser's track record? I checked. They're clean. No apparent ties to Heartline or its subsidiaries. Okay. There's one additional condition from their side, Gerald said. They want access to the vehicle for their own forensic team to document before the independent appraisal. Not to take it, just to examine and photograph. Cho's framing is that they want to understand what they're buying. Ethan thought about this. That's reasonable, he said. Dana Rice's team gets the same access, same window. A pause. I'm not sure Heartline will agree to that. They will, Ethan said. Tell Cho the condition is parallel access. If they won't agree to that, we go back to where we were. Gerald called back 3 hours later. Cho agreed, he said. Parallel access, simultaneous if possible. Ethan stood in the bay doorway with the phone and looked at the shop and the lot and the winter bare trees at the property edge and felt the specific quality of a situation arriving at the shape you'd worked toward. Not triumph, not relief exactly, but the recognition of a thing settling into its right configuration. Set up the second meeting, he said. Outside, the January cold was doing what January cold does, which is persist, and Lot 34 sat in the bay where Ethan had moved it after stripping it, its essential structure exposed and labeled, patient under the fluorescent light, waiting for the next thing. The second meeting happened on February 5th, 9 days before the deadline. Gerald had pushed for Murfreesboro again, but Cassandra's office had countered with Ethan's shop, which surprised both of them. Gerald because it was unusual. Ethan because it was smart. Coming to his territory meant something, and he understood she understood that, and he respected the understanding. He said yes. They arrived at 9 a.m. in 2 vehicles, Cassandra and Cho in the Escalade, Dana Rice and a forensic engineer named Petrov in a rented Suburban. Gerald came from Millhaven and parked behind both of them and walked into the shop with his yellow legal pad and the expression of a man who had not expected his practice of small county law to ever involve this particular configuration of parties. Ethan had cleared Bay 1, not cleaned it up for presentation. The shop looked like a working shop, oil on the floor, tools on the benches, the smell of metal and solvent that was simply the atmosphere of the place. But he'd moved the work vehicles out and set up the folding table he used for parts layout with 4 chairs around it, which was the closest he was going to get to a conference room. Lot 34 was in Bay 2, under lights, stripped to its structure, components laid out in the sequence he'd documented them. He let Petrov and Heartline's forensic engineer, a man named Garza, who arrived in a second vehicle with equipment cases, work first. They went into Bay 2 together, which was Ethan's condition for the parallel access. They worked the same session, the same space, each documenting what they found without interference from the other side. He stayed out of it except to answer direct questions about condition or sequence of disassembly, which both men asked periodically, and which he answered the same way to both. Cassandra stood in Bay 1 and watched the examination through the open bay door. She had a coffee from the thermos Ethan had put on the folding table. She'd taken it without being asked, which was a small thing, but told him something about how she was choosing to occupy this space. Cho was on her phone most of the first hour, positioned near the bay door with her back partly turned, conducting a separate conversation in a low, continuous voice that Ethan didn't try to hear. Dana Rice sat at the folding table with her own documents, cross-referencing against her notes. She had met Ethan briefly before and greeted him with the compressed professional warmth of someone who understood that this was not the moment for extended acknowledgement. The examination took 2.5 hours. At one point, Petrov called Ethan into Bay 2 and pointed at the powertrain configuration, the specific interface his father had admired in the notebook, the one Ethan had stood over himself thinking about reduction rather than elaboration. "Can you confirm the assembly sequence here?" Petrov asked. His English carried a faint Eastern European accent, and his attention to the components was the most focused Ethan had seen from anyone looking at the vehicle. "The electrical interface mounts first," Ethan said, "then the mechanical bridge. The sequence is in my documentation." He retrieved the relevant pages, and Petrov read them carefully, nodding once, and photographed each page. Garza, from Hartline's side, had been photographing the same components. He heard the exchange and looked at the pages himself. He didn't say anything, but his expression told Ethan that what he was seeing was confirming something he'd already suspected. By 11:30, both teams had finished their initial examination and retreated to their respective principals. Petrov had a quiet conversation with Dana Rice at the folding table. Garza had a longer conversation with Cho, much of it inaudible. Cassandra stayed where she'd been standing, by the bay door, finishing her second coffee. Ethan sat on the work stool he kept by the lift and waited. It was Cho who came to him first. She sat in one of the folding chairs, set her notepad on the table, and looked at him directly. Our engineer confirms the vehicle is consistent with the documented characteristics of the 7RX04 prototype, she said. He can't rule out the possibility of a sophisticated reproduction, but he rates that possibility as extremely low given the material analysis. It's not a reproduction, Ethan said. I'm telling you our engineer's assessment. I understand. What's Hartline's position? Cho glanced toward where Cassandra was standing, then back at Ethan. We're prepared to proceed with the agreed structure. Independent appraisal with the Atlanta firm. Endowment agreement drawn up in parallel so both can close simultaneously. She paused. There's one modification to the endowment structure that legal wants to propose. What modification? The naming. Hartline's board wants to attach a corporate name to the program. Ethan looked at her. No. Cho blinked once. It's standard practice for endowed programs. I know it's standard. The program isn't named for a corporation. He thought for a moment. It'll be named for my father, James Mercer. That's the name on it. A pause. The board may push back on that. Tell them the endowment condition stands as agreed or the vehicle goes to independent auction, Ethan said. Gerald can draft the letter. Cho absorbed this with the professional composure of someone who is paid to absorb difficult positions without visible reaction. She made a note. She stood and went back to Cassandra. Ethan watched them talk. He couldn't hear it. He watched Cassandra's face while Cho spoke, watched the small movement of her jaw when she processed the naming issue, the brief pause before she responded, the single nod that came after. Cho came back to the table. The board will accept James Mercer as the program name, she said. Cassandra made the call. Ethan looked across the bay at Cassandra, who was looking back at him. He gave a small nod. She returned it. Gerald, who had been sitting in the corner with his legal pad and had filled 6 pages already, said, I'll draw up the preliminary agreement this afternoon. The independent appraisal took 3 weeks. The Atlanta firm sent 2 assessors who spent a full day at the shop in mid-February, working with the disassembled components and Ethan's documentation and Garza's report and Petrov's report and 3 historical references that the firm had sourced independently from automotive archives. They were meticulous in a different way than the forensic engineers, quieter, more interested in provenance than mechanics, asking questions about the auction and the estate history and the chain of custody that Ethan answered as thoroughly as he could. Their final report came in on February 28th, 2 weeks after the legal deadline had passed. The deadline passing without the physical vehicle being in anyone's possession had been an anxiety point for Dana Rice, who had called Ethan twice in the 10 days before February 14th, asking whether the examination documentation would be sufficient for the court filing. He had told her what he knew, that the examination had been conducted, that both teams had documented findings, that the appraisal was in process. She had said she understood, but her voice had the careful quality of someone managing worry rather than not feeling it. What happened at the deadline was that Hartline's legal team filed a motion with the court acknowledging the existence of the 7RX04 prototype and stating that Hartline was engaged in good faith negotiations regarding its acquisition, which was a legal maneuver Gerald explained was equivalent to saying we know it exists and we're not going to pretend otherwise, which in the context of the litigation was a significant shift from Hartline's prior posture of non-acknowledgement. They essentially confirmed your vehicle in federal court, Gerald said on the phone that evening. Whatever happens with the appraisal and the sale, the evidentiary fact of the prototype's existence is now part of the case record. Dana Rice called an hour later. Did you see the filing? Gerald told me about it. It changes the case, she said. There was something in her voice that was the release of long-held pressure, Not celebration, which would have been premature, but the specific quality of a door opening after a long time of finding it locked. Is it enough? Ethan asked. It's significant. Whether it's enough depends on how the court weighs prior art, how strong their rebuttal is, whether the judge allows the examination documentation as supplemental evidence. A pause. But we're not fighting in the dark anymore. That matters. The appraisal report, when it arrived, valued the vehicle at $620,000, based on historical significance, confirmed prototype status, condition relative to other surviving vehicles of its type, and the relevance of the associated documentation. The range was given as $580,000 to $650,000, with the midpoint figure representing the assessor's best estimate for a transaction between a willing buyer and a willing seller with full information. Ethan read the report twice. He thought about $2,500 and a check written before the auction opened. He thought about Fisk's face when he'd said $52,000 for the coupe. He thought about the balance in his account before October and after. He called Gerald. $620, he said. I saw, Gerald said. How do you feel about that number? It's accurate, Ethan said. Heartline will accept it. They won't negotiate. They agreed to the independent appraisal process. So contesting the outcome would undermine the framework they agreed to. A pause. Ethan, this is a significant amount of money. I know. What are you going to do with it? Ethan looked out the window at the shop. Marcus was visible through the bay door, working on the last of the auction vehicles. The lot was nearly clear. Most of the 17 had been restored, sold, or identified as scrap and properly disposed of. The operation looked different than it had in October. Not dramatically. The building was the same, the sign was the same, the gravel drive was still rough in the same places, but the quality of its organization had changed. The way a workspace changes when the person working in it has stopped being afraid of the next month. Put the endowment in motion first, he said. Get with Dana's team and make sure they have what they need from the examination. Then we close. Gerald made his sound of professional approval, which was a brief exhalation rather than a word. I'll call Cho. The closing happened on March 12th, in the same conference room in Murfreesboro where the first real meeting had taken place. Same table, same water pitchers, different light. The March sun was actual rather than theoretical, coming through the windows at an angle that the January light hadn't managed. Gerald and Cho handled most of the paperwork, which was thorough. The vehicle sale agreement, the endowment structure documents, the access and documentation agreements that formalized what had been done informally in Ethan's bay. Ethan read everything Gerald put in front of him and signed where he was supposed to sign. Cassandra was there. She read and signed on Heartline's side, and Ethan noticed she read as carefully as he did, which was more carefully than most people in these situations bothered to, since their lawyers had done the reading. She was not someone who delegated her own understanding. When everything was signed and the room had the particular settled feeling of completed business, Cho began gathering documents, and the IP specialist, who had reappeared for the closing, began organizing his copies. Gerald was writing final notes with the focused satisfaction of a lawyer whose work had come out cleanly. Cassandra stayed seated. She poured herself another water and looked at the stack of documents in front of her. The endowment documents are with Heartline's foundation office, she said to Ethan. The James Mercer program. It'll take 60 to 90 days to finalize the fund structure, but the capital is set aside and protected regardless. I know, Gerald walked me through the structure. I want you to be involved in the program design, she said, not as a consultant on Heartline's payroll, as an independent voice. The structure you outlined in that folder you brought to the second meeting, that's what the program should look like. He looked at her. That's a condition that wasn't in the documents. It's not a condition, she said. It's a request. A beat. He understood the distinction. She wasn't binding him to anything, wasn't trying to claim influence over something he'd set in motion. She was asking. I'll be involved, he said. She nodded. She seemed about to stand and then didn't. She had the manner of someone who had something to say and was deciding the exact form it should take. I've been in this industry for 20 years, she said. I've done a lot of transactions, a lot of negotiations. I've had situations where something I needed was held by someone who wanted more than I was willing to pay. And I've had situations where I paid more than I thought something was worth because the alternative was worse. She paused. This is the first time someone made me feel like the problem wasn't the price. Ethan waited. You made me feel like the problem was what I was going to do with it, she said. Like the thing I was buying had a direction it was supposed to go, and I needed to be the right person to take it there. She stopped. I don't usually feel that way about acquisitions. You're not usually buying something someone's father helped build, Ethan said. No. She was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, I looked at your father's personnel file from the Meridian records, what Heartline has from the absorption. He was regarded as exceptional, specifically for the quality of his documentation. Ethan felt something move in his chest that was not grief exactly, but was adjacent to it, the particular sensation of hearing someone you loved described accurately by a stranger. He was particular about it, Ethan said. He used to say that if you didn't write down what you did it for yourself. If you wrote it down, you did it for whoever came next. Cassandra looked at him. That's why you kept the notebooks. That's why I kept the notebooks. She stood up, gathered her documents. Gerald shook hands with Cho, and they exchanged the professionally warm farewells of opposing counsel who had come through a difficult negotiation without drawing blood. The IP specialist left first, then Cho. Gerald gathered his legal pad, he'd filled 11 pages today, and went to use the restroom before driving back to Millhaven. Ethan and Cassandra were alone in the room for the second time. She extended her hand. He shook it. Her grip was direct, no performance in it. The video is still up, she said. The one from the auction. I know. The comments are different now than they were in October. Marcus tells me things, Ethan said. The internet decided you were a genius about 4 weeks ago, she said, after the Memphis sale price got out. There's a version where you planned all of this very carefully and executed it brilliantly. There's a version where I recognized something I'd spent my whole life learning to recognize and acted on it, Ethan said. Those are different things. Are they? He thought about it. Planning implies a specific outcome you're working toward. I didn't know exactly how this would land. I just knew what the vehicle was and what it was worth, and that selling it cheap to make someone's legal problem go away wasn't the right thing. He paused. The rest of it found its own shape. She looked at him for a moment with the expression he still didn't quite have a name for. The one he'd been seeing in pieces since the first meeting, the one that was neither admiration nor its simpler relative. More like the expression of someone adjusting a picture they'd been carrying in their head for a long time. Good luck with the restoration work, she said, whatever comes next. Same to you, he said, with the case. She left. He heard the Escalade in the parking lot. He sat for a moment in the quiet conference room with the March light coming through the windows at its actual angle and felt, not triumph, still not quite that. Something quieter and more durable. The feeling of a thing having been handled correctly. Gerald came back in and stood in the doorway with his legal pad under his arm. That was some meeting, he said. Which one? All of them, the series. He sat down across from where Ethan was sitting. What happens to the vehicle now? Heartline's logistics team picks it up next week, Ethan said. They'll do a complete restoration before it goes to their legal team as evidence. After the case concludes, it becomes part of their heritage collection. That was in the sale agreement. You're okay with that? Ethan considered. I wanted it to go somewhere with people who understand what it is. Their heritage collection is better than a private collector's garage. A pause. And the engineers who built it, or their families, will be able to see it there. That matters. Gerald nodded slowly. What about the other vehicles? You've got a few left from the auction lot. 2 that need work. 1 I'm partway through. Probably another month before they're done. And then? Ethan looked at the table. He'd been thinking about this, about what the next thing looked like now that this particular sequence was complete. The operation had changed. The shop's reputation had changed. The phone had been ringing with restoration inquiries since January, when word had moved through the collector network that something serious was happening in Copeland County. He had a list of pending projects that would keep him and Marcus busy for 6 months, and he turned down 3 he didn't want. Then the work, he said. Same as always. Just the work, Gerald said, with a slight smile that was genuinely affectionate rather than ironic. The work is enough, Ethan said. The court ruling came down in late April, 7 weeks after the closing. Ethan heard about it from Dana Rice, who called on a Thursday afternoon while he was in the middle of a carburetor rebuild. The real kind, not a clean one, the kind where the passages were so fouled it took 3 soakings and careful work with picks to get them clear. The court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs on 4 of the 7 patent claims, she said. Her voice had a quality he hadn't heard from her before, the specific relief of someone who has been carrying weight for a long time and has just set it down. Not entirely, not all of it, but enough to feel the difference. 4 of 7, he said. The 3 it didn't cover are peripheral. The 4 it covered are the core configurations, including the powertrain interface. A pause. The examination documentation was admitted. Petrov's analysis was cited directly in the ruling. Ethan set down the pick he'd been using. He sat on the stool next to the workbench. What does it mean for the engineers? Damages are still to be determined. The ruling establishes liability, not the amount, but based on comparable cases and the scope of the patents. She stopped herself. It's significant. The families of the 2 engineers who passed away are included in the class. My father's estate, he said. Yes, Gerald has the details. We've been in touch with him. There's a process. He looked at the carburetor parts laid out on the cloth in front of him, clean, labeled, waiting to be reassembled. How are the engineers taking it? One of them, Werner, the oldest, he's 78. He called me this morning and said he didn't care about the money. He just wanted someone in a courtroom to say the work was real. Her voice shifted slightly on the last sentence. That it happened, and it was theirs. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He thought about his father's final notebook entry and the 9 characteristics written in different ink, and the line, if it surfaces someday, whoever finds it will need to know what to look for. He got that, Ethan said. He did. A pause. Thank you, Mr. Mercer, for handling it the way you handled it. It was the right thing, he said. That's all it was. After he hung up, he sat for a few minutes without moving. Marcus was in Bay 2, visible through the open door, doing something with a floor jack and whistling badly off-key the way he did when he was concentrating. Outside, the April afternoon was warm enough that the bay doors were open for the first time since October, and the air coming through smelled of cut grass from somewhere down County Road 7. He picked up the pick and went back to the carburetor passages. Quote, the reversal in public narrative, the internet's swift reclassification of Ethan from fool to genius, happened gradually and then fast, the way most things on the internet happened. By late March, automotive publications had run pieces on the auction and its aftermath. By April, 2 larger outlets had picked up the story, each framing it slightly differently, but all of them centering the same basic element. A small-town mechanic had walked into a county auction, paid $2,500 for 17 rusted vehicles, and walked out with something that changed the outcome of a federal patent case worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The video from the fairgrounds was everywhere again, but now the comments were different. The slow zoom edit with the melancholy piano had been replaced, in the cultural memory of the thing, by a version with a different score. Something more triumphant, though Ethan hadn't watched either version and didn't intend to. He got calls. A lot of calls. Television segments, podcast requests, a book inquiry from a publisher in New York, an offer from a premium automotive network to do a series about the shop. Marcus printed out the list of media requests once a week and left it on Ethan's desk. And once a week, Ethan put it in the bottom drawer and kept working. You're not going to do any of them? Marcus asked, on a Friday afternoon in mid-April. Which one would you do? Ethan asked. He was doing body work on the second-to-last auction vehicle, a fastback that needed new metal in both door skins. Marcus thought about it. The podcast, maybe. Or the automotive network thing. That could be good for business. Business is already good, Ethan said. It could be better. Better than what we can handle isn't better, Ethan said. It's just more. Marcus looked at the stack of incoming work orders on the desk. It was a real stack. 8 projects, several of them significant, all of them from collectors who'd heard about the shop through the growing reputation. The phone rang twice most mornings now with new inquiries, some of which Ethan took and some of which he deferred and some of which he declined because the vehicle wasn't right or the client's expectations weren't aligned with what the shop actually did. "There's a reporter outside," Marcus said, "same one as yesterday. Tell him I'm working." "I did. He said he'll wait." "He can wait in the road," Ethan said. "He's not waiting in my lot." Marcus went and delivered this message. Ethan heard the conversation from the bay, Marcus's polite firmness, the reporter's mild protest, the eventual sound of a car starting and pulling away. Marcus came back with the expression of someone who had done something slightly awkward and was choosing to find it amusing. "He said this is a story whether you talk to him or not," Marcus reported. "He's right," Ethan said. "That's fine. It doesn't bother you, people writing about you without talking to you?" Ethan looked at the doorskin in front of him. He made a mark with a scribe where the cut needed to go. "The story is the story," he said. "What I did or didn't do with that vehicle doesn't change based on whether I explained it to someone. What if they get it wrong?" "Some will," he said. "I can't work and manage what other people say about the work at the same time. So I work." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had the young man's discomfort with the idea of letting a narrative develop without your participation, which was understandable. They were a generation that had grown up understanding narrative as something you tended, something that required maintenance. The idea of opting out of it was alien to him in a way it wasn't to Ethan. "The Cassandra Hale thing," Marcus said. "There's a piece claiming she's, I don't know, like she had a change of heart, that the whole deal happened because she had some personal transformation." Ethan cut along the mark. "People like that story. Is it true?" He thought about the conference room and the first time and the way she'd moved from the end of the table to a position across from him without apparently deciding to. He thought about her reading carefully, about "it's not interpretive," about asking for the program outlines. Something shifted, he said, whether that's a transformation or just someone doing what they were always capable of doing once the situation was clear enough. "I don't know. I'm not inside her head." "You talk to her more than anyone else in that room," Marcus said. "You must have a sense of it." Ethan set down the cutting tool. He looked at the rough edge of the cut, assessed it, made a small adjustment. "She's someone who's very good at her job," he said, "and her job, up till a certain point, required her to treat the vehicle as an obstacle rather than a thing. Once she couldn't maintain that position, she was capable of something different." He paused. "That's not a transformation. That's just what happens when the information changes." "Some people don't change even when the information changes," Marcus said. "Yeah," Ethan said. "Those are different problems." Marcus went back to his work. Ethan went back to his. The bay was quiet in the way it was in the afternoon when both of them were focused. Just the sounds of tools and the occasional vehicle on County Road 7 and the birds that had returned with the April warmth to the trees at the edge of the property. Cassandra's statement came out the third week of April, in the context of a shareholder communication about the patent ruling and its financial implications. Most of it was formal. Acknowledgement of the ruling, statement of Heartline's intent to honor the judgment, outline of the remediation process. Standard corporate language for a difficult situation, handled publicly. The last paragraph was different. Gerald read it to Ethan over the phone, which was how Ethan encountered most things he was eventually going to have an opinion about. Heartline has also completed the acquisition and transfer of the 7RX04 prototype to our heritage collection, where it will be preserved and made accessible to researchers and automotive historians. We are proud to have reached an agreement that reflects the vehicle's true historical significance. In addition, Heartline has established the James Mercer Restoration Program, a permanent endowment to support vocational training in traditional automotive restoration craft. This program represents, in our view, the most meaningful outcome of a process that began with our own failure to recognize the value of expertise that doesn't announce itself. We are grateful for that correction. Gerald finished reading. He waited. "Huh," Ethan said. "Yeah," Gerald said. "That last sentence is going to get more attention than the rest of the statement combined." "It's accurate." "It is. That doesn't usually stop executives from not saying it in public." Ethan thought about the conference room, the water pitchers, the pale January light. He thought about Cassandra standing at the window with her back to him, and the quality of the pause before she turned. "She meant it," he said. "I believe you," Gerald said. "I'm just noting that she said it publicly, in a shareholder communication, which is not nothing." "No," Ethan agreed. "It's not nothing." He sat at the kitchen table after he hung up. The cardboard box with the notebooks was still there. He'd never moved it back under the workbench after October, and at this point it had been on the kitchen table long enough to become furniture. He put his hand on the box. Not opening it, just contact. His father had been meticulous about documentation because he believed the work was bigger than the person doing it. Had believed that if you did something well and wrote it down carefully, the thing outlasted you in a form that could be found and used by whoever needed it next. Had spent his career in the unglamorous middle distance of institutional work. Not the person who got the credit, not the person in the boardroom, the person who solved the problem in the engineering bay and wrote it down correctly. Ethan had been that person too, for 20 years in Copeland County. Working on old things, keeping what was good, trying to put things back in the world correctly. The vehicle was in Heartline's Heritage Collection now, which was probably the right place for it. Accessible, documented, no longer hidden. The engineers who had built it had a legal ruling with their names attached to the work. The program that would carry his father's name was being structured in Nashville with an endowment that would still be there in 30 years. None of it was tidy. The lawsuit damages were still being litigated. Werner, the 78-year-old engineer who just wanted someone to say the work was real, had gotten that but might not live to see the financial resolution. The internet's version of the story was already simplifying itself into a fable it could repeat without complication, losing the actual texture of it. Heartline was better than it had been, probably, but it was still a corporation with a corporation's imperatives. Fair wasn't tidy, it was just accurate. There was a difference. Marcus knocked on the kitchen doorframe. He'd developed the habit of knocking rather than walking in directly, which had started as a professional courtesy and had become something more like respect. "Someone on the phone," he said. "Collector from Seattle. Says he's been trying to get a slot for 6 months." "Tell him to try again in September," Ethan said. "He said he has a 66 Shelby that needs—" "September," Ethan said. Marcus relayed this. There was a brief pause and the call ended. "You know you could hire 2 more people and double the throughput," Marcus said. "Yeah." "You're not going to?" "No." Because I can do 6 restorations a year properly," Ethan said. "With 2 more people, I can do 12 improperly. Those aren't the same business." Marcus sat down at the kitchen table across from him. He had been doing this occasionally in the past few months, sitting, staying past clock out, asking the questions he'd been accumulating during the workday. Ethan didn't mind. He'd been 23 once and had had questions he didn't know who to ask. "When the program starts," Marcus said, "the James Mercer program, are any of the people from here going to be involved in running it, like teaching?" Ethan looked at him. "Are you asking if you're going to be involved?" Marcus had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "Maybe." "You've been here 3 years," Ethan said. "You're good. You're getting better. When the program is running, if you want to teach some hours, we can talk about how that works with your schedule." Marcus nodded. He was trying not to look pleased in a way that revealed how much he'd wanted that answer, and not entirely succeeding. "Okay," he said. "It's not going to be easy work," Ethan said. "Teaching is different from doing. You have to be able to explain the thing and watch someone do it wrong and not fix it for them, which is harder than it sounds." "I know." "Do you?" A pause. "I'm learning," Marcus said. "That's enough," Ethan said. "That's how everything starts." Outside, the April afternoon was doing what April afternoons do in Tennessee, which is be generous. Warm light, green things coming up along the fence lines, the persistent sound of birds going about their business in the trees. The shop sat at the end of the gravel drive, looking like what it was, a working place, modest and specific, full of knowledge that didn't announce itself, tended by people who understood that the value of a thing and its appearance were 2 separate conversations. And in the bottom drawer of Ethan's desk, under the weekly media request lists he'd never respond to, was the check receipt from the Harlan County auction, $2,500 paid in full, October 14th, for 17 vehicles that everyone had agreed were worthless. He'd kept it not as a trophy, more as a reminder of the particular kind of patience required to see what was actually there, rather than what the room had decided to see. His father had tried to teach him that patience for 30 years. It turned out he'd been paying attention. The last 2 vehicles from the auction lot were finished by the end of May. Lot 3, the one Ethan had been partway through when Cassandra's board approved the endowment, turned out to be cleaner underneath than it appeared from the outside, which was the best kind of surprise a restoration produced. The frame was solid, the body metal sound except for one section of the passenger floor that needed new steel. He and Marcus finished it in 12 days, and it sold to a buyer from Birmingham who had been on the waiting list since February and who drove down on a Saturday morning, looked at the car for 20 minutes, and wrote a check for $31,000 without asking for a reduction. Lot 16 was harder. It had looked promising in the lot and turned out to have rust in the structural rails that wasn't visible until Ethan got the body off, at which point the decision was either to do it right, sourcing correct replacement sections, welding properly, not taking shortcuts that would hold for 5 years and fail at 10, or to stop and sell it as a project car to someone who wanted the work. He did it right. It took 3 weeks longer than he'd budgeted and cost him more in materials than the margin supported cleanly. And when it was done, it was correct and he was satisfied with it, and it sold for $26,000 to a collector in Chattanooga who understood exactly what he was looking at. The auction lot was finished. 17 vehicles acquired for $2,500, 14 restored and sold over 8 months, 2 identified as genuine scrap and disposed of properly, 1, Lot 34, transferred to Heartline's Heritage Collection for $620,000. Ethan did the accounting one evening in late May, sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a calculator, and when he got to the end of the column, he sat back and looked at the number for a while. He was not a man who had ever thought about wealth in the abstract, as a destination, as an identity. Money in the operation had always been about capacity, enough to buy the right parts, enough to take the jobs that deserved the time, enough to not make decisions from fear. The auction had moved him from one category to another in ways that still felt slightly unreal. Not because the numbers were false, but because the distance from where he'd been in September to where he was in May was longer than his internal map of himself had fully registered. He wasn't rich in the way the word usually meant. He was a small shop mechanic in a rural county in Tennessee with a truck that had 240,000 miles on it and a building he owned free and clear and a reputation that was now larger than the building. That was a different kind of position than the one he'd been in before, but it was still a working position. It still required showing up every morning and doing the work correctly. He put the legal pad in the desk drawer. He went to bed. What? The James Mercer Restoration Program held its first information session in September, 10 months after the auction. The venue was a rented space in a community college in Mill Haven, not Heartline's doing, but Ethan's, who had pushed for the program to be rooted in the community rather than in a corporation's facility. The endowment paid for the space, for the instructors, for the vehicles that would serve as working projects, for the stipends that made it possible for participants to commit fully rather than fitting it around jobs they couldn't afford to leave. Ethan had been involved in the design from the beginning, the way Cassandra had asked him to be at the closing. He had spent 3 months working with a program director named Sylvie Okafor, a woman in her 40s who had run vocational programs in Nashville for 15 years and who had the particular intelligence of someone who understood both what was being taught and how learning actually happened in people. To translate his 12 pages of kitchen table outlines into something that could actually function. It had been more difficult than he'd expected, and Sylvie had told him early on, with professional directness, that the difficulty was entirely predictable. The problem with master craftspeople designing programs, she'd said in their third meeting, is that you know the thing so completely you've stopped being able to see where the gaps are for someone who doesn't know it yet. You skip steps you don't know you're skipping because they feel obvious. Like what? Like reading a vehicle's history from its surface before you open it. She had looked at her notes. You mentioned this in your outline as a preliminary skill. You gave it half a sentence. How long did it take you to develop it? He thought about it honestly. 20 years, probably. The first 10 I was learning to look. The second 10 I was learning what I was looking at. Right, she said. So that's not a preliminary skill. That's the thing the whole program is trying to build. It needs to be the spine, not a footnote. He'd rewritten the outline. It was better the second time, and better still the third, and by the time Sylvie was satisfied with it, it was a document he was genuinely proud of, not because it was elaborate, but because it was honest about what the work actually required, about how long things took, about the difference between competency that was performed and competency that was real. The first cohort was 6 people. Sylvie had reviewed 43 applications. Ethan had read every one, not to select, that was Sylvie's process, and he trusted it, but to understand who was out there. What he found surprised him, in volume, if not in kind. Young people from every background, some with formal automotive training, some with none, all of them with the specific hunger of people who had felt something in the work and wanted more of it than the mainstream pathways offered. A 20-year-old from East Nashville who had been fixing his grandmother's car since he was 15. A 31-year-old woman from rural Georgia who had worked in a body shop for 8 years and knew she'd learned everything her employer could teach her. A 25-year-old from just outside Memphis who had studied mechanical engineering for 2 years before dropping out because the classroom felt like a translation of something that was better experienced directly. 6 people. 2 years. Working projects, real vehicles, instruction from practitioners. Ethan was not the primary instructor. He'd made that clear with Sylvie from the beginning. He was a working shop owner, not a full-time teacher, and the program needed instructors who could be consistently present. He was a contributing voice, a resource, the person who came in periodically to look at the work and ask the questions that the primary instructors might be too close to ask. He described his role to Sylvie as being like the second opinion in a diagnostic, not the one doing the daily work, but the one you called when you wanted to check your reasoning against someone else's. But he showed up for the first session. He stood at the back of the rented room while Sylvie introduced the program and the schedule and the working philosophy. 6 people in folding chairs, notebooks out, some of them clearly nervous. One of them, the woman from Georgia, whose name was Priya, looking at the room with the evaluating attention of someone who had been disappointed before and was waiting to see whether this was different. When Sylvie finished, she introduced Ethan. He walked to the front of the room. He was not a man who gave speeches. He stood in front of 6 people in folding chairs and thought about what was actually true and said it. "I'm not going to tell you this work is important," he said. "You already know that, or you wouldn't be here. I'm not going to tell you it's endangered, because you probably know that too." He paused. "What I'll tell you is what my father told me, which is that the work is bigger than the person doing it. If you do it right, and you document it, and you teach what you know to someone else before you're done, then the thing you made and the thing you understood outlast you. That's the only kind of permanence that's available in this line of work." He stopped. "That's it. Sylvie knows everything else. Listen to her." He sat down at the back of the room. Priya, the woman from Georgia, turned around and looked at him for a moment. She had the expression of someone recalibrating an expectation. Then she turned back to Sylvie. No. Marcus started teaching 1 afternoon a week in October, 6 months into the program's first year. He taught basic diagnostics, how to read what a vehicle was telling you before you opened anything, how to look at surface evidence and build a working theory rather than a conclusion. He was 24 years old and teaching people who were in some cases older than him. And the first 2 sessions were awkward in the visible way that things are awkward when the person doing them hasn't yet found their own version of the form. Ethan watched the second session from the doorway of the shop, not announcing himself. He watched Marcus try to explain something about rust patterns, how the distribution of oxidation told you about a vehicle's history, where it had been stored, what it had been exposed to, and saw him struggle with Sylvie's point about skipping steps, the thing master craftspeople did without knowing they were doing it. Marcus kept landing on conclusions when what he needed was to slow down to the evidence. He was working with Priya, as it happened. She asked a question that stopped Marcus mid-sentence, a specific question, the kind that came from paying close attention, that revealed a gap in Marcus's explanation rather than a gap in her understanding. Marcus thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "You're right, I skipped a step. Let me back up." And he backed up and found the step he'd skipped and explained it clearly. And Priya nodded in the way people nod when something they'd almost understood becomes fully understood. Ethan went back to his work. Later that afternoon, Marcus came into the bay where Ethan was finishing a brake job on a customer's vehicle. Not a restoration, just a regular service job, which Ethan still took occasionally because he believed in keeping his hands on ordinary work as well as exceptional work. "You were watching," Marcus said, "for a few minutes." "And?" Ethan looked at him. "You caught yourself. That's the thing. I skipped the whole evidence to inference bridge. Priya basically caught it for me." "She did," Ethan said. "That means you're teaching her well enough that she can catch your mistakes. That's better than teaching her perfectly." Marcus thought about this. "I don't know if that's a compliment." "It's an observation," Ethan said. "Compliments are for when the work is finished. This isn't finished." Marcus made the sound of someone who was both mildly frustrated and actually fine with the situation. He went back to his own work. Ethan finished the brake job. Outside, October had arrived with its flat Tennessee light, and the trees along the fence line had started turning the particular colors they turned when the season decided to be honest about itself. The damage ruling in the patent case came down in November, 13 months after the auction. Ethan heard about it from Gerald before he heard about it from Dana Rice, which was unusual. Gerald had been monitoring the case developments more closely than Ethan had, for reasons that were partly professional and partly the investment of a man who had watched a situation develop from the beginning and felt a stake in its outcome. $240 million in total damages, Gerald said, distributed across the plaintiff class. Your father's estate is included. You'll be contacted directly by the class counsel. The amount attributable to his contributions is based on a methodology they established early in the case. It won't be the largest individual allocation, but it won't be negligible. Ethan was at the bench when Gerald called. He was doing paperwork, which he did badly and consistently, the least natural part of running the operation. How are the engineers taking it? Werner died in August, Gerald said. His family receives his allocation. The others, Dana says there's a range of reactions. One of them said he didn't want the money, that the ruling was enough. One has already started talking about what he's going to do with it. A pause. Dana said one of them asked about you specifically, wanted to know if you were going to be at any kind of public acknowledgement. Is there going to be a public acknowledgement? The plaintiff's attorneys are planning a press event, nothing elaborate. Dana asked if you'd participate. Ethan thought about the reporter who'd waited in the road in April and the media list in the bottom drawer and the internet's simplified version of the story. He thought about Werner, who had wanted someone to say the work was real and had gotten that and had died in August. I'll go if the engineers want me there, he said. Not for a press event, but if Werner's family is there or if the other engineers want to meet, yeah, I'll go. I'll tell Dana. The gathering happened in December, in Nashville, in a law office conference room that was nicer than the one in Murfreesboro, but had the same basic quality of a room that had absorbed difficult conversations. Dana Rice was there, and 2 attorneys from the plaintiff's firm, and the 4 living engineers, and Werner's daughter and son-in-law, and Ethan. Gerald had driven with him. They were the last to arrive. The engineers were older men, ranging from mid-60s to one who was 73, and they had the quality of people who had spent their careers in the practical middle of things. Not the glamorous work, not the work that got named after you, but the work that made everything else possible. Ethan recognized it because he'd grown up looking at it in his father. The youngest of them, a man named Callahan, who was 66 and still doing occasional consulting, shook Ethan's hand in the doorway before anyone else reached him. Your father, Callahan said. James Mercer. I worked with him for 2 years on the project. Ethan looked at him. He had not expected this. Not this specific, this direct. I know, he said. He mentioned the team in his notebooks. He was the best documentarian I ever saw, Callahan said. Every solution we found, every dead end, he had it written down by end of day. I used to tease him about it. Said he was writing the biography of every bolt. He paused. The pause had weight in it. He was right to do it, as it turned out. Yeah, Ethan said. I was sorry to hear he was gone. I didn't know until Dana found us when the case started. That's the thing about the way we scattered. Nobody knew where anyone ended up. He would have wanted to know about the case, Ethan said. He would have wanted to be involved. Callahan nodded slowly. I think he was involved, he said, just differently than the rest of us. Werner's daughter was a woman in her 50s named Claire, who had her father's compact build and the slightly formal manner of someone conducting themselves carefully through an emotional situation. She found Ethan after the group had settled with coffee, and the lawyers had given a brief summary of the damage ruling. Dad talked about the project his whole life, she said. He didn't talk about the legal situation. That was more recent. But the car itself, what it was, what they built, he always described it as the best work he ever did, the work that nobody saw. It wasn't seen for a long time, Ethan said.